apologies for absence from Assembly Member Denbish.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the list of officers in the report and ask if you have any additional declarations of interest to give us? No, thank you very much. Item 3 is the minutes of the last meeting. Can I ask the committee to agree the minutes of the meeting of the Housing Committee held on the 5th of December 2017 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. And then we have item 4, the summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the completed and outstanding actions from previous meetings? Agreed. Thank you. So yes, now on to the main item, the draft London plan. This was published at the beginning of December, and all the different committees who are concerned with planning are looking at this across the Assembly. The Planning Committee was yesterday, the Environment Committee I think has already looked at it. We'll be putting in responses to the consultation. And today we're going to be discussing issues around housing. I just wanted to say to members of the public who may be watching, it's really important that you respond to the London plan as well. And actually the GLA have made that really easy. There's a website, if you just search for London plan on the internet, the website lets you leave individual comments on individual policies. So even if just one thing from this meeting, from any of the other parts of the London plan that you want to comment on bothers you, make sure that you put in comments to the Mayor so that it can go into the consultation. The deadline is the 2nd of March. So I just want to say that. And I want to welcome our guests. We have James Murray, who is the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development. We have James Clark, who is Senior Manager for Housing Strategy at the GLA. We have Darren Richards, also from the planning team at the GLA. We'll get you a sign at some point soon. And then from the boroughs, we have Mark Bagent, who is from the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. He's one of the directors for housing and regeneration there. We have Steve Moore, who is the Director of Neighbourhoods from the London Borough of Havering, and Martin Thomas, who is the Development and Transport Planning Manager from the London Borough of Havering as well. So yes, we are here to ask lots of questions, focusing on the housing aspects of the London plan. Can I ask James just to start off by telling us how important housing is to what's in the planning policies and how we got to the point of this draft?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, for inviting me along this morning and just giving me a few moments to set out some of the overall context of this. The London plan draws together all of the Mayor's different policies around housing, employment, open space, culture, so on, across the board. But from my point of view, Deputy Mayor for Housing, clearly the housing targets in it are central to what I'm working on for the Mayor. And I think the really important starting point for understanding how this London plan fits into broader conversations around housing delivery are that it essentially says it is possible to pretty much meet London's needs within London without building on the green belt or open space. And the way in which it says that is that it's based on the evidence base of the SHMAR, the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, which I'm sure we'll discuss later on, which identifies a need for 66,000 homes a year. And on the basis of a response to that evidence need for 66,000 homes a year, it identifies capacity for 65,000 homes a year, through a combination of various measures, which I'm sure we'll discuss in greater detail around densification, around building on small sites, and so on. But I think it's quite important to lay that out because it is saying up front it is possible to build the homes that London needs, because sometimes the housing crisis can seem so enormous that people wonder where to begin in tackling it, whereas what the London plan is saying is up front the capacity is there. The more important and far more difficult part of the conversation then becomes how do we deliver those homes. So identifying the theoretical capacity is clearly a first and essential step, and getting the planning permissions in place for that is necessary, but it's not sufficient to get them built. We need to make sure we've got the delivery mechanisms to make sure those homes are built. And that's again where the London plan is very clear about the extra powers, resources, levels of investment that London would need in order to build those homes. So, for instance, investment in affordable housing. The London plan sets out a target for 65,000 homes a year, 50% affordable. It also makes clear within the London plan that if we were to deliver that, we would need investment in affordable housing at first estimates to go from the current level of around £500 million a year up to around £2.7 billion a year investment in affordable housing. So it is clear about what we would need in terms of powers, resources, investment and so on to actually do the delivery of these homes. So just to say, I think that's one important distinction to make so we understand the context of the London Plan and its targets, and that it is a essential and I think quite important first step to say here in principle is where the homes could go. Clearly what we need to work on with partners in boroughs, with private industry, housing associations and crucially government is getting those homes actually delivered, which needs other interventions that the planning system alone can't necessarily deliver. It does need to work in conjunction with investment, land assembly powers, delivery capacity and so on. But as an overall framework, it's essentially saying that it is possible to build the homes that we need in London. The London Plan is also very clear around affordable housing. The Mayor setting his strategic target of 50% affordable housing, and it sets out the ways in which he sees us as moving toward that level. A combination of those homes which are affordable gained through planning conditions, where there is no public subsidy or public grant going into the development, the 35% threshold approach, which is integrated within the London Plan, and it sets out how that planning approach to gaining affordable housing will work in conjunction with other levers to deliver affordable housing. So affordable housing investment, taking the affordable housing on developments where investment is applied above beyond 35% to 40%, up toward 50% and so on, and public land being put into developments at a discount to market to make sure that it can support a greater level of affordable housing than would otherwise be the case. So affordable housing is at the centre of that argument. So I thought I'll probably leave it there because otherwise I'm in danger of running through all of the topics before we get on to questions. But I think just to set up that headline for me, which is the London Plan identifies the overall capacity, says here's where the homes could be built, 50% affordable, but the other part of the discussion, which is referenced by the plan, but is a bigger and broader discussion, is around the delivery of those numbers.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's useful. We have follow-up questions on a lot of those issues coming. If we start with David has some questions about the targets.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Good morning. And first question to you, James. You mentioned 65,000 capacity. That's a possibility. But how many homes can London realistically deliver over the next few years, and sort of going from now up to, say, 10 years in the future?
So at the moment, the number of homes delivered every year varies from year to year, but it tends to be around 30,000 homes a year, around that level. So clearly the targets, the capacity which is set out in the London Plan is very ambitious. It's a step change. It's not just a slight dialing up of where we are now. It is a step change to a fundamentally higher level of delivery, which is why we're really clear in the London Plan and in the housing strategy which is aligned with it, that going from where we are now to hitting the targets in the London Plan would require a real step change in terms of investment, in terms of resources and powers that the GLA and councils had, and in terms of the capacity to deliver, not least to the construction sector as well. So I think that it's very clear about, whilst the 65,000 capacity is identified by the London Plan, the delivery, which I think your question touches on, is a broader set of questions which goes beyond just the planning consents required into the investment delivery mechanisms.
When do you think that you will reach and hit your 65,000 target?
So we know that increasing the number of homes is going to require a lot of extra investment and resources. What the Mayor has set out is how we can identify the capacity for those homes. But being honest, increasing the level of delivery also depends on a lot of external factors. So how much investment we can secure from government, what happens in terms of the construction sector, and not least around the workforce in the construction sector will be impacted by changes in our relationship with the European Union. There's a lot of other issues which will affect our capacity to build. But as I said, what the London Plan sets out is where these homes could go and sets out some of the broad parameters around what we would need to ensure their delivery.
Okay. Well, now the London Plan seems to mention that a lot of this delivery that you want will be in the outer London boroughs and East London. And why have you selected those areas why do you think that you'll be able to build so much, a larger share of London's new housing in those areas?
So what the London Plan sets out is a way in which every borough in London will play its part in meeting the housing targets. And being very honest, these are ambitious targets for boroughs to meet. They are ambitious in terms of how many homes we expect different boroughs to contribute. So I think we need to be really clear that we want to work with boroughs to make sure that the delivery of those homes is enabled. It will be through a combination of two main sorts of sites though. The large sites, which are the ones which historically, or at least in recent years, a lot more of the development in London has concentrated on, and those smaller sites where the London Plan sets out a framework whereby the delivery of housing on smaller sites could increase substantially. And part of the reason for that is that smaller sites have advantages over larger sites, and they tend to be, it tends to encourage small and medium builders rather than relying just on a small number of large volume builders. They tend to be built up more quickly because once a small builder acquires a small site, if they have certainty over the planning, they just want to get on and build it rather than sitting on it for a long time. And it also means you're more likely to have smaller developments in places in outer London where even the market prices can be more relatively affordable to people in London. So really the aim of setting out the targets across London in every London borough and of setting out the difference between small sites and large sites is about diversifying the sort of homes we build. So at the moment, or in the last few years, we've become quite dependent on large schemes which are done by large developers building at a pace which is consistent with their business model and delivering some affordable housing as a planning gain as a result of that. What we need to do is diversify the range of homes being built substantially. That's clearly by getting councils and housing associations to build, but it's also about making sure that we're building on those smaller sites using small and medium builders as well as just relying on the large volume home builders.
Okay, so what I take from what you've said is that you see more building on smaller sites in outer London. So that sort of answers part of my question.
Well, just to be clear, so the London Plan, there are sort of two arguments there. The first argument is that every borough in London has a target, clearly, in the London Plan, and so every borough will need to play its part in contribution to the overall housing targets in London. Alongside that, you've also got the emphasis on small sites, which can apply in outer London, but also applies in inner London, it applies across the board. That introduction of an emphasis on smaller sites alongside the larger ones.
But how about the east of London, sort of, I suppose, boroughs like Newham, Barking and Dagenham, Redbridge and so on? Do you seem to have higher targets in those boroughs as well? Is that correct? And how do you see that being delivered?
So all of the targets which are identified for individual boroughs have come out of the Strategic Housing Land Assessment, the SHLA, which identifies the capacity in boroughs across London. So that's a piece of work which has been done collaboratively between the GLA and boroughs. I will be honest, and they are ambitious targets for a lot of boroughs, but they are targets where they have been developed in consultation with those boroughs involved.
Okay. Now, my last question. I mean, you say these are all ambitious targets, but if boroughs are struggling to meet the targets that they have, what extra support will you be able to offer to enable them to reach the targets and to deliver what you've set them to do?
So we want to work very closely with boroughs around the delivery of these homes. So the London Plan sets out, as I said in my introduction, the overall framework for how these homes could be built, or where the capacity is to build them. We want to work closely with boroughs to try and enable their delivery. So when boroughs are developing their local plans, to make sure that they are delivery focused, and so that we can work with boroughs to ensure their local plans show how these homes could be delivered. There's also some more direct working with councils we can do in certain key areas. You mentioned some of the boroughs in East London. Barking, for instance, Barking Dagenham are taking a big lead on a lot of the development in their area, getting closely involved with some of the major sites, Barking Riverside and so on. So there are ways in which boroughs can work with us around land assembly, around flexible investment, around infrastructure, including transport investment, to unlock those sites and bring them forward more quickly. So our message is very much that yes, we are setting ambitious targets for every borough, but at the same time we want to work closely with boroughs and use all of our resources to support them in delivering as many of those homes as they can.
Well, thank you.
Can we ask the boroughs what they think? Because I think if we start with Tower Hamlets, Newham, Greenwich, they have the highest targets across London, much higher than some of the outer London boroughs. How are you reacting to the instructions in the London plan?
For Tower Hamlets, we're already growing faster than any other borough in London. We've got almost 14,000 homes on site in development at the moment across the borough, another 12,000 in the planning system at various stages. So there's nothing frightening for us about this. The issue for us, I think, is what was just said about infrastructure. So we welcome growth. We want the growth to be supported by the infrastructure. And if you take something like the Lower Lee Valley, which is a housing zone at the moment, it's a popular riverside opportunity area in terms of the new plan, then it's really about the little bits of infrastructure like bridges across the river and things like that that really open up that development area into something that really connects up with the wider area and makes those new homes places to live rather than just new homes. So that's really what we're looking for. In terms of the small sites, in Tower Hamlets, most of what we're looking at is larger sites. We have some small sites, particularly in council ownership, council estate infill programmes and so on. And I think our main concern there is around the capacity of the industry. So we do struggle to find local builders who will take on those small sites. We tend to try and package them up for the larger construction companies to deliver, but again, they're stretched as well. So building capacity in the local industry is very important to us, and we're investing in a training facility to that end with other East London boroughs.
Okay, thank you. And Havering, you've presumably had a bigger change in your target, and you're not as happy about that, I think.
Well, that's a question for local politicians, I suppose. From an officer perspective, what I will say is in Havering, we've been very proactive over the last 12 to 18 months, worked very closely with the GLA in delivering about £3 billion worth of new housing over the last 12 months, and they're en route with the councils into joint venture 50-50 deadlock partnerships with those developers as well. So we want to be at the forefront of designing those schemes that are coming forward as well. I think the key thing, if I can be quite honest with you, is on a daily basis we're hearing stuff from our residents saying, I can't get into the hospital at the moment. If you move to Romford today, you can't get your children into a primary school in Romford, and it's very difficult to move across the borough from a transport perspective. It has very strong east-west connectivity, but very poor north-south connectivity. So I think when we talk to our current population in relation to growth and seeing an increased population through additional housing sites coming in, they quite rightly say, well, that's fine, but how's that going to impact on my quality of life if you don't put the essential infrastructure alongside it when you develop areas? That to me is a real challenge. I know we're talking specifically about housing. I tend not to think of it like that. I tend to think about total regeneration and all of the infrastructure you need to build good growth in what we do going forward. And that to me is a real challenge that we face when we deal with our members on a day-to-day basis, and when we try to communicate that message to our public. It's extremely, if you live in the south of the borough, say in Rainham, it can take you 2.5 hours to get to work if you live in Romford, and that's 6 miles away. So I'm just trying to put that into context for you.
By public transport?
By public transport. So it's extremely difficult. It doesn't have the infrastructure. What we can do, I always think it's a strong argument, if the infrastructure needs are there and put on the table at the same time, I think the local population accepts it a lot more. And I think the numbers in a way then become a little bit of an irrelevance. I'm saying that from an officer perspective. It's really about making sure that the infrastructure is fit for purpose as we move forward. Disappointingly for us as a borough, when the Mayor's transport strategy came out for consultation, spent a lot of time feeding back into that process, talking about north-south connectivity, talking about how that could open up maybe more sites for development, looking at key transport nodes like Gallows Corner. I don't know if you're familiar with these areas, but they're quite hot spots on the bottom of the A12 and something fundamental around a ring road. Disappointingly, Havering seemed to have been forgotten as part of that plan and wasn't mentioned, and we made our views very, very clear at that time. From a senior officer perspective, it makes it very, very difficult for me to convince our local population, our members, it's the right thing to do when we don't get any recognition in relation to consultation. So in summary, I think it's about being more holistic. I think the City for All London strategy is a good strategy. I think it talks primarily about infrastructure, and we need to see that happen and work alongside the phasing of regeneration as it moves forward.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Nikki, you have a question?
Yes, it was just for James. I just wondered, James, the 270,000 planning permissions, which aren't yet built, if that's still the figure, are they part of the targets? The 65,000, 66 a year, do they include those?
So the sites on which those 270,000 consents exist would have been taken into consideration as part of the SHLAR process to identify the capacity for 65,000. So the sites where there may be planning permission but homes are not yet built, those sites which showed up in that stat of 270,000 also inputted into the SHLAR process to come up with the 65,000. So broadly, yes. I was just trying to answer that.
The answer's yes.
Well, I was just trying to answer it quite carefully because it's basically the same source of sites. So the sites which are identified as part of the 270,000 consents which are not yet built. Some of those sites will be some of those sites which are included in the SHLAR. Not all of them, because clearly there'll be other sites and other sources of land which go into the SHLAR. But they do feed into it, so it's not double counting, as it were. The 270,000 are not in addition to the 65,000 a year.
No, they're part of it.
Yeah.
So Tower Hamlets targets then include their as yet unbuilt permissions. And Haverings.
So the 65,000 homes a year, that could comprise a combination of homes which already have permission but are not built, and all homes which do not have permission at all.
Of course, I understand that. Is that, and you can confirm that, can you, Tower Hamlets and Havering, that your targets per year include your sites which have permissions but not yet built? Correct. Okay, that's useful. It's interesting to know. Okay, and none of these, are there any mechanisms in the London plan to speed up those planning permissions to be built? Because they're already under CAN.
Yeah, so one of the important things in the London plan is around the threshold approach to viability into affordable housing. And in that threshold approach, that gives an incentive to build out permissions quickly, to implement them within 2 years. So if you get the fast track approach through the London plan, the 35% or 50% on public land, you only benefit from the fast track approach if that permission is implemented within 2 years. So there is an incentive there to make sure that anything which gets consent on that basis then is implemented quickly. Otherwise you trigger an early stage review, a viability analysis, and so the benefits of the fast track route fall away. So in terms of new consents given under the Mayor's approach to viability, there is an emphasis about implementation. In terms of the bigger question around...
Sorry, is that just for that'll only be for new permissions, won't it? Not for these old
Exactly.
So it won't... it's not quite answering my question.
No, it was just adding to
adding another plan, but it won't incentivise those already built.
That's correct, yeah, because it only applies to new permissions. So in terms of the 270,000, I mean, this was an issue which the Mayor raised directly with the Chancellor last year, and although the Mayor felt that the budget in November fell far short of what he would expect in terms of support for housing. One door which he welcomed being opened was around this investigation which Oliver Letwin was commissioned to do, which is now underway, which is about looking at why there are so many consents which are not implemented. And the Mayor has views on this, which we want to make sure feed into the review. Things around the infrastructure needed to bring forward development in London, picking up with Steve's point that he just made. Also around the need for investment in London, given a lot of the development is high density and so on. But I think the way that we tackle those 270,000 is via a broader conversation around what are the barriers to delivery, which kind of comes to my central point around the kind of, you can have the capacity on the one hand, and given that the planning consensus is essential, but where we really need to focus a lot of our energy and effort is on delivery and what investment and what mechanisms are needed to get those permissions implemented.
Thank you.
Yes, so come back to the point about delivery, and I think the points that Steve was making are, I mean, I know Havering very well, and I think I tried once to get to Rainham and back by public transport, and thereafter always drove, because I think the connectivity and the wider issues relating to housing within the plan are absolutely critical. Jules at the Environment Committee was talking about good growth, and I don't see how plonking housing down where there is insufficient infrastructure to surround it, including and especially making sure that there are very well served public transport opportunities with bus routes and bus lanes to get people out of their individual vehicles, because one of the problems therefore is that people in Havering take the choice that I did, which is that, you know, and then of course you end up with massive congestion that people can't get in and out of Rainham, which is actually very beautiful, and I would commend anyone to go and visit Rainham Marshes if you've not yet done so. But you know, it's really impossible for people living there. The distance from Rainham to Romford is incredibly small. And it sounds like a complete mistake for us to try and impose higher targets, because that's how it will be seen. So my questions are, how are we going to carry the borough with us in terms of the politicians, but also more particularly, how are we going to carry local people, and how are we fitting together these targets together with the concept of good growth, which is that it's not just housing, but that all of that connectivity is happening at the same time. And I'd like you to start, James, and maybe Steve or even Martin might want to add something about how we can make that happen, obviously specifically in Havering.
Yeah, and I think the question you raise about how do we bring Londoners with us as we're building a lot more housing is really essential to what we're doing in the London Plan more broadly. And there isn't a definitive list of what we need to do, but I would say three things jump out as me as being important. I think firstly, making sure that we've got a decent level of affordable housing, I think means that people will see a development and see the disruption and so on that might go with it, but see the benefits of it in terms of genuinely affordable housing to benefit local people. So I think that's an important part to have as any development. I think the design is really important, particularly if we're building at higher densities. That historically have been the case. People want to see it being well designed and safe and so on in terms of how those are planned. And thirdly, as you say, infrastructure. People want the reassurance the infrastructure is there. I mean, there is a housing infrastructure fund which the government set out last July. The team here worked over the summer to get those bids in for the large, they're called forward funding bids. There's also smaller ones, the marginal viability.
Do we have any? Do we know the outcome of the bids yet? The last time I asked this question, we didn't.
They are all in with government.
We're still waiting.
We're waiting to see what the feedback there is. From our point of view, you know, we want answers as quickly as possible, because obviously it helps us get on with delivery, but also there is quite a tight time scale around the spending of that money. So from everyone's point of view, it'd be
the sooner we know, the longer we actually might have to get on with spending it if we are given an allocation.
And if we get that certainty quickly, then we can say in certain areas, look, this infrastructure is coming in the next 2 years or whatever the timescale is. Therefore, you have certainty to get on the build in that location. So that's a really important part for us, is getting that housing infrastructure funding to come through, and also to bid on any further money that comes through housing infrastructure funding.
Thank you, Chair. I have a sort of technical question on.
I wanted to see if they wanted to answer as well.
Okay, sorry. In that case,
add very briefly. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Just two things really. I mean, there's been a lot made of Crossrail, and obviously everyone's excited about Crossrail coming through London, especially out part of London as well. I mean, we're very fortunate. We're picking up 3 Crossrail stations, which is really positive for the borough.
Still east-west though.
Yeah, but it's east-west again, and that's what I was going to say. It's not north-south, and I think the point I'd make is significant investment in north-south connectivity can open up more development opportunity for good growth. rather than just trying to use the sites we've currently got at the moment. I think that's an important one to get across. So any investments, whether here for whatever it might be, would be very much welcomed. I suppose the other thing, from my point of view, that we have one or two examples of poor design within the borough historically, and what poor design does to local authorities is it increases demand on the public purse locally. It can increase levels of antisocial behaviour, increase demand, poor public spaces, all of these opportunities, or there could be a lack of adult assisted living accommodation or children residential accommodations. All these things in social care budgets are coming under significant pressure at the moment. If we don't get the regeneration right, it's going to increase the pressure on the public purse locally. So certainly from a Havering point of view, what we're trying to do is we're trying to see regeneration as an opportunity where we can manage down demand. And the only way you can manage down demand is if you have the whole sort of good growth agenda at the heart of what you do. It has to have the infrastructure, it has to have the public realm, it has to have healthy places, it has to have connectivity. All of those things that myself and I'm sure everyone around the table aspires to have when they decide where it is they're going to live. It's the basic needs. So we have to be extremely careful, because if we get it wrong, it's going to be a long time wrong.
Thank you. James?
Sorry to can I make one more point, just sort of drawing out one element of that just into a slightly broader conversation, which is that I think it's worth just remembering that, you know, one of the key reasons why London's population has been increasing is because jobs have been created successfully in the last couple of decades. So jobs have gone up, people have moved to London to work on those jobs, housing has failed to keep up. You know, and that's really at the core of the crisis. Because you've got people in London to work on those jobs, that then leads to, it doesn't mean that people aren't here, it's just they're living in overcrowding, or they're travelling long distances, or they're not able to move into a home which is suitable for their family, or whatever the impact of that might be. So actually building housing is in part around meeting existing need, which is in London, but currently means that people are not living in appropriate housing. So there is already, to a degree, some of that some of the people living here using transport links and so on, just not living in the right sort of homes for them. So some of the building housing is about building new homes to meet that need, and then when you build that new housing, you get community infrastructure levy, you get Section 106, you get all the extra investment from that development, which can then go into supporting further infrastructure. So it's I suppose it's not quite as binary maybe in terms of there being, you know, new development which is needed, and then people come and live in those homes. People living in London already. We need to make sure that we've got homes which are suitable for everyone's needs.
Sorry, before we go move on to Tom, sorry. Can I just, in terms of the housing strategy, which the Havering team criticised, you've been feeding into that about where there might be failings in terms of how the planned infrastructure, the planning around the housing strategy will help you deliver new homes. That's something you've been liaising with the other deputy mayor about.
About the housing strategy?
About the transport strategy.
Transport, sorry.
This seems to be really key to getting the housing strategy right.
In terms of the transport strategy, you know, our myself and Deputy Mayor for Transport and our teams are closely liaising about it constantly. You know, always working out about what transport investment is needed for housing, and it doesn't mean we're always going to be able to give everyone the answer that they want, but you can rest assured that we are in constant routine conversation about it.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Sorry, Tom has been waiting for ages.
I just had a sort of technical question really to do with housing need versus housing demand, because the SHMA is an assessment of need, correct? But need and demand aren't the same thing. So, for example, a overseas property investor doesn't need a home in London, but that does generate demand for housing in London. So how is that factored in? Of these 23,037 market sale homes that were needed to be built every year, or is it assumed that all of those will go to owner-occupiers, or is it assumed that some of those will be bought by overseas investors or domestic property specialists?
So I might ask James to come in with any further technical detail on this, but the basis of the SHMA is on everyone who will live in London's housing need being met.
Everyone who will live.
Everyone who lives in London, their housing need being met. So that will mean there may be sort of latent demand, latent need, as in people who are living in overcrowding now, who need a home which is suitable for their needs. and population growth on the back of job growth and so on, to make sure we keep up with that. So it is about making sure that if you fulfilled the parameters of the SHMAR over time, you would provide the housing that everyone needed.
But the people that might end up, in the case of market sale housing, actually owning those homes aren't necessarily the people that need them. They might be renting them out, but that's generating extra demand, is it not?
The new market.
The SHMAR doesn't distinguish, for precisely this reason,
Yes.
the SHMAR doesn't distinguish between, within the market category, it doesn't distinguish between own occupation and private renting, because as the question indicates, it's not possible. The planning system isn't able to kind of regulate for that or put occupancy criteria or whatever. And I think the assumption is that on market sale homes that are subsequently bought by investors, all the evidence suggests that the vast majority of those are then rented out to Londoners. So there's a separate debate about whether that's the best outcome or not, but from a kind of meeting people's housing needs perspective, the SHMAR treats that as kind of all within the market category, if that makes sense. So in the past we have been asked, can the SHMAR try and distinguish between the need for private rented housing and the need for own occupation housing? It's just not possible because it's not something we can regulate through policy.
I appreciate that's difficult, but I guess I'm not sure of making my point that well, but there's a kind of there's an argument that there's a almost infinite demand for London property out there, and if you build market sale, you could build market sale that you could move up and up and up, and you still wouldn't address the affordability side of the when it comes to market sale, because you just keep sucking in demand from overseas. Is there anything in the plan or in the housing strategy that sort of takes that into account?
I mean, I suppose in a way, we step back a second. You say this sort of endless demand for London property. I mean, actually, you should look at it another way. I mean, say at the moment we're building 30,000 odd homes a year, and actually, if you compare what we're building and the breakdown of affordability within that versus what we would need, you can say we are building most of the market homes we need. What we really need is a lot more affordable housing. So in terms of the actual demand in London, the clearly unmet demand, and therefore actually where you could build most rapidly at pace, is affordable housing. So if you look at it from the other angle, it actually shows the demand is strongest for affordable housing.
Absolutely. Well, hence why 65%
that.
we know that. I'm just,
Well,
I don't know.
I
I just thought it was interesting about this difference between demand and need on the sort of market side.
I thought but that's what the SHMAR says. It's not just we know it; it's that the SHMAR actually says that. But if you wanted to increase housing supply overall to the levels which are set out through the SHMAR and broadly met with the London Plan, you need an emphasis on new affordable housing, because that's where the demand is to absorb those new homes into the system.
Okay, thank you. I think
Very quickly.
I think
Andrew, I think was
Andrew's been waiting for a very long time. I just wanted to clarify what Tom just said as well.
Come in on that.
Okay, fair enough. Nikki, do you want to...
Just as a real quickie, Havering, do you have areas of community regeneration, strategic areas for regeneration in Havering? You do?
Yes,
You do?
Yeah.
Because we're very keen to make sure, this is about how you can get communities to accept what's going on, to include much earlier community engagement in planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Mayor has a policy in the London Plan to resource that in areas of opportunity, but he doesn't have a similar policy in areas for strategic regeneration which are not in areas of opportunity. And it seems to us these are some of the most stressed areas in the country. And it seems rather important that it's not just left to boroughs to do that, to get that early involvement. And I wondered if you had a view on this.
Chair, if I may, early consultation, engagement with communities on any big development is absolutely critical.
Not just a voice, but a role.
And a role. So any developer worth their salt will tell you that they will put in a lot of time and efforts with the local authority to engage the current community on any redevelopment opportunity, because the most important thing is to understand what the local people that are currently there want and need, So, for example, I mentioned about we've got a lack of primary school provision within Romford at the moment. If you spoke to the current population in Romford, they would tell you we need more primary schools. And again, if that's something that's needed locally, that's a good way to get local people involved, so there's something out of it for them as part of the regeneration. It's very important. If you don't engage the local community very, very early in shaping what you're going to do, it makes it a far more difficult, and that in itself slows up the process. So that then becomes a block because people then challenge. So early engagement is critical.
And the question is really, I'm not just talking about developers getting involved. It's when you're doing an area of regeneration, you're looking at the acceptance, you're looking at all the different services and the stress on those services. And these are people who don't normally have a voice, because in an area of regeneration you can tell a lot of people will be vague. They won't have much time, they won't have normally been involved. You need resources to involve them. Is that done?
What I would say, if it's
not what communities are telling us.
So
I don't know about Havering.
If it's a large-scale development that's subject to a master
planning, we're talking about an area, yes.
Yeah, so like a master planning exercise that would be carried out, like in Bean Park or something like that. There's an awful lot of public engagement because it's large-scale. I suppose the flip side to that would be if you fragmented that down using lots and lots of different small sites, you would probably effectively, or you could argue you might lose the effectiveness of how you then engage the local community on very small scale site development coming forward. So I suppose that's a challenge to look out for in relation to the small sites proposal.
Certainly as far as some of the work we've done down in Rainham with the London Riverside area, that involved quite a lot of community engagement through the preparation of our Rainham Development Framework and Master Plan. There were a number of sessions with the community based in Romford to polish that and get it accepted.
Right, okay, thank you.
There was a good discussion yesterday at the Planning Committee about public engagement around the density and the form of new developments. I think that is useful to watch if anyone hasn't seen it already. Can I just clear up the point that Tom was, I think, trying to make, which I think is that the SHMAR sets out the need from Londoners for housing each year, and it doesn't take into account the demand for housing from overseas. So if we're delivering homes to these targets, every single one that gets bought by somebody who isn't intending to live in it, who isn't a Londoner, who is part of the SHMAR assessment, is kind of knocked off the total.
Unmet need. Yeah. Thank you, that's exactly the point I was trying to make. Thank you,
that is correct. And that's the essence of the first dibs promises that the Mayor made. And so I just wanted to ask, where does this, is there anything that's made it through into the London Plan? I appreciate it's difficult to deal with that problem of first dibs and the fact that that's not meeting the SHMAR need if those homes go to overseas investors.
If a home, which was for market sale, a market home identified within the SHMAR target, if that were to be bought by an investor, a UK investor, an overseas investor, whoever, but were then rented out at private rates to a Londoner, that would be seen to be meeting a Londoner's housing need. Okay, so it's not about owner occupation versus renting. It's not about.
It's about the ones that are not occupied. So that's the issue, isn't it?
Exactly, but it is important to separate them out, because I think what some of the research we did last year showed is that in certain areas there seem to be spikes in homes which appear to be left empty, but across the board the level of permanent emptiness is low, and most homes bought by overseas buyers numerically, I appreciate there may be particular hotspots where they get attention, but across the board most homes are rented out if they're bought. And I think it's just important to separate that out, because they are two different issues, because it's not actually about ownership, it's about use of that home. So if the home is built as a market home, bought by an investor, or whether domestic or international, and then rented out, that is seen as meeting a housing need of a Londoner, because there's someone who's living here and renting it out.
So it meets the target in the SHMAR, but the question then is what affordability is a separate question. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you could technically meet someone's housing need, even if it were. You might actually want it to be at a more affordable rate. You see what I mean? So you could have private rents being above where you'd like rents to be, but technically someone is housed in that home. The separate question is around, I think, emptiness, which I think is a very specific sort of subset of investor properties, which is clearly associated with overseas, not exclusively, but it's more typically associated with overseas buyers. And there is a hook in the London Plan where it supports boroughs to develop local responses to that, and one of the reasons for that is because the evidence base at this stage shows that whilst it's not a London-wide problem, there are particular areas where it may be more of a problem. So the London Plan offers a hook for boroughs to develop tailored responses in those local areas, rather than applying a London-wide policy, blanket policy to everywhere in London, for which the evidence, we don't have that evidence base to do that policy.
And those local responses might be, say planning conditions, that there must be lease conditions imposed, that they are occupied.
It could be up to local authority to develop. Yeah.
Andrew, your question.
Actually, I don't know what the difference is between foreign investment and investment, really. It all sounds rather xenophobic when we only sort of pick on foreign investors, but still, that's an aside.
By foreign, I just mean outside of London, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay, outside the
Outside Lewisham.
Nothing. Probably.
Can I just ask Mr. Moore, or the Havering team, is there anything in the London Plan that supports your ambition to get better north-south community transport within Havering?
As I said earlier on, Chair, I can only refer to the recent draft transport strategy, which disappointingly didn't pick up on the conversations we'd had with colleagues, and it was quite silent in relation to the transport infrastructure. So based on that, we have continued conversations with TfL to try to understand exactly what the opportunities may be going forward. To be fair, there is an element of feasibility work that is being carried out at the moment. It's been funded through the LIP.
We're using some LIP funding to part fund feasibility work. That work is due to come to an initial conclusion next month, and we'll then hope to discuss that with the Mayor and his colleagues.
Yeah. And we would like to really present that forward because we do believe that that's the correct way to go, to make sure the transport infrastructure is there first.
And this is something that you've identified in your local plans, however, is it?
It is, and our local plan is due for submission shortly.
Local plan is due for submission next month, and it highlights in particular the need for major improvements in public transport infrastructure investment and the north-south connectivity issue very strongly.
In dealing with the London Plan, it's been quite difficult for us as Housing Committee and Planning Committee to stop trampling over each other's territory. But as we all know, transport is a housing issue, and housing can be considered a transport issue. So it's quite difficult, and I know that we're slightly going over the boundary here. But do you think it's, perhaps it's for the politicians to say, but don't you think it's rather unfair if the GLA, the Mayor, is asking you to build to full capacity but won't offer any help that you're asking for?
All I would respond to with that, Chair, is, as it goes back to what I said at the start, that good growth requires a holistic approach, whether it be planning, housing or transportation. You can't look at these things in isolation. You have to look at them together.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, so we're moving on now to questions of affordability specifically. Now, I know there's overlap here between funding questions and planning questions, and the more we can save time by focusing on the planning questions, the better. So the questions are, what are we doing within planning, within this London plan, to affect fund housing that's affordable, that is not what we're funding. Those are really what I'm trying to focus on, just to try and save a bit of time. So there's a list of the Mayor's preferred affordable tenures within here, which are London affordable rents, which is social rent, or very close to that, London living rent, which is defined per ward against average incomes, it's about 30% of average wages, and London shared ownership, which is the shared ownership product that we're all familiar with. Within that, though, there's still flexibility for other types of affordable housing, and the definition of affordable at 80% of market rents still occurs within here. It seems to me like many developers, private developers not being funded by you, could use this plan to argue that they can deliver affordable housing at 80% of market rents and still call that affordable. Have you tried to change that with the government? I know that we have a case in London that our rents are about double the average for England, that 80% of market rents in London doesn't represent affordable in any way. Have we tried to get that definition, which I know is in the National Planning Policy Framework, have we tried to get that removed for London? Have the government refused us?
So without repeating conversations we've had before, both here and I think via press release, the 80% definition, as we know, is from the 2012 NPPF, so it's from the National Planning Policy Framework. The London Plan exists within the overall National Planning Policy Framework, so the inclusion of the definition of affordable rent in the glossary, and it would be worth minuting this just so there's no future confusion about this. Anything in the glossary doesn't necessarily mean an endorsement of it, it's just explaining what that means. So affordable rent is defined nationally, and so a definition in the glossary refers to that. And just as worth bearing that in mind in case that issue comes up again, because I know we have spoken about it several times. But what the Mayor is really clear on is what he considers to be genuinely affordable. He is upfront that when we are doing housing for low-cost rent, 80% of market rent is not affordable in most parts of London, and so that's why he set the London affordable rent, which, as you indicated, is essentially social rent level housing, as what should be delivered for the general needs rented part of affordable housing. So in a way, he is strengthening the hands of local boroughs, because they can point to the London Plan steer on affordability rather than having to fall in line with simply the national definition at the 80%, which the Mayor believes is not genuinely affordable in most parts of London. They can lean on his definition of affordable to make sure it is genuinely so.
I appreciate that. I mean, you say that the affordable housing definition is defined nationally. That is true, and I'm not saying that we wouldn't have to deviate from what's in the NPPF. But we are a special case in London in terms of housing affordability. We could get permission from the DCLG to deviate from that definition and define affordability in terms of wages. If they let us, they write the laws, they could let us do that.
I mean, we've had numerous conversations with DCLG, MHCLG about what status the London Plan has. The status quo is that the London Plan exists within the general framework of the NPPF, so the affordable rent definition still exists as a national definition. Within the London Plan, it's very clear for that low-cost rented housing, the Mayor expects it to be at London affordable rent, which is social rent-based benchmarks or below. So the Mayor is going to, as strong a steer as possible within the national framework, that what he expects to see for genuinely affordable homes for low-cost rent is homes based on social rent levels.
Okay, so to try and force up the percentage of affordable housing, you're using this threshold approach, where if you can get to 35%, you as a developer gain some benefits in terms of not having to disclose all your viability and all of that and these different constraints. Can a developer point to homes it's planning to deliver at 80% of market rent and say that that counts towards that 35% threshold? I can't find anything in this London Plan, and it's, planning policies have to be written really carefully, that constrains them to the definitions that are preferred by the Mayor.
So the 35% threshold approach, we've got the one here, it sets out what the expectations are if you were going to go down the 35% route, and that is that the tenure mix within that 35% should meet what's set out in the London Plan. So it's in policy H6, let me just find the exact part here, C2. So in order to go down the threshold route, applications must be consistent with the relevant tenure split in H7. So it's not the case that an applicant could come forward with, let's say, 35% of affordable housing that was not considered genuinely affordable and just go through the fast track route, because in order to benefit from the fast track route, as H6 C2 sets out, the mix of affordable housing within that 35% has to be consistent with the relevant 10-year split.
So in H7 Part 3, it leaves 40% of that 10-year split to be determined by the relevant borough based on identified need, provided they are consistent with the definition of affordable housing. That seems to me to open up the door to developers pointing at things that are 80% market rate.
So
these people have very clever lawyers. This seems to me a way of getting out of it.
It's consistent with the definition of affordable housing that the Mayor sets out in the London Plan.
Then
it needs to say that.
Then it needs to say that.
If you look at 4.7.2, there's a presumption that 40%, which is decided by the borough, should focus on social rent or London affordable rent, given the need.
However, it's a broad
not in the box.
maybe.
It's not in the, as Nikki often says, if it's not in the box.
Doesn't count. And if it says should, it's very weak. It should say must.
Yes, it should say must, because I don't think so.
And it should be in the box.
I asked the Mayor a long time, in fact I asked yourself a long time ago, when the Mayor talks about his targets, is he talking about his definition of affordability or the government's definition of affordability? And I was told it was his definition of affordability. His 50% target was his political target, based upon what his definition of affordability
Well, this is a question
not
about
the government.
Reporting and monitoring as well. Will you only be reporting and monitoring the achievement of the targets? You know, you've got in there the 50 to 60% affordable targets for public land. Will you only be reporting those for things that meet the Mayor's definition of affordability? Or will you be counting other things too?
So as I understand it, the monitoring affordable housing is being updated, and I can maybe get some more detail from Darren around the exact reporting requirements about the London Development Database. I think it was a Mayor's question which we responded to you on, just to update you that that is being updated, the detail in which it's recording affordable housing outputs. But the plan is very clear in terms of what the Mayor considers to be genuinely affordable. And as you set out in your question, it sets out London affordable rent or below, London living rent and London shared ownership as the three products which he considers to be affordable. That aligns with the housing strategy. So whether it's funded or whether it's delivered through planning condition, the definitions are consistent.
So you'd be content for us to feedback that this definition needs tightening up to specifically exclude things that go up to 80% of market rent?
If you have concerns about the relationship between the London Plan and the National Planning Policy Framework, then feel free to write it down.
And I have, yes. Okay. Can I also ask you about gross versus net things? This is and I'm really getting into the detail of the planning policy now. But essentially, you've got your overall targets of 35%. People following the threshold approach, and that applies to things that are above 10 units of any kind of development. Then you've got your overall 50 to 60% target looking at public land. And then you've got the estate regeneration policy, for which the threshold approach is somewhat of an exception. The estate regeneration policy says all things must go through the viability tested route, which is full disclosure and trying to get the absolute maximum possible in a quite public way out. H10 says, that's the estate regeneration policy, where there's a loss of existing social housing. And then obviously, like I said before, H6, which is the threshold policy, talks about developments above 10 homes. Is there any limit to where H10 will apply, a lower limit at the number of, if there's a loss of affordable of social housing, is that just more than 10, or is it any loss of social housing that would go through the viability tested route? It's just there seems to be a bit of a gap.
This policy is not limited to the size of development, so this is saying wherever affordable housing is lost, it should be re-provided. And clearly, the Mayor will only have direct jurisdiction over applications which are above the threshold of referable applications, but in terms of the planning policy here in the London Plan, this applies to any loss of existing affordable housing.
Because all that policy later says that all such schemes will go through the viability tested route, and that would then apply to anything that even demolished one social home. Is that right?
I believe so. Yes.
Because that would be really useful if that's what it says.
I believe that would be the case. Yeah.
That's really useful.
I was just double check because we don't see the small ones, but I'm pretty sure that's
just
really
repeat,
right.
what is it he's happy to... Sorry, Jamie.
So the viability tested route seems to apply to every development where any social homes are demolished, even if it's one, even if it's not an estate as such. And that would be really useful for everyone to see.
Can I start? Does the discounted... Sorry, both...
Can I finish my question about gross versus net? And then where you're looking at 50 and 60% on public land, where there's homes being demolished, is that net, the net homes? Because obviously if you are demolishing 200 affordable homes and then you're building a development that has, say, 800 homes, 400 of which are affordable, you could argue that's 50%, or you could argue that's 25% of the net gain.
So just to be clear, when you keep saying 50 and 60%, what are you...
On the public land, you're setting you're aiming to get 50% and sometimes 60% if you are putting in money as well.
No. So 60% is the target we set with strategic partners who we're funding on a flexible basis.
Yes,
so
that's what I mean. Yeah.
That's not public land.
Oh, that's anything where you're working with.
It might be, but
Okay.
it's because that's a funding thing. So that's basically saying that if we have a strategic partner, so one of the big housing associations, for instance, who we're funding, their programmes should aim for 60% overall, irrespective of whether it's private or public land. So the 50% fast track applies to public land sites. Just to be clear on that.
Okay, well, but I mean, both of those targets then are relevant to my question because those are likely to be sites where there are existing homes. So is 50 or 50 to 60, is that net or gross that you're expecting to see?
I mean, they might be. They might be sites where there are existing homes, but they wouldn't necessarily be. So it could be land that is, for instance, Holloway Prison, which is a live case, which is one which is being sold by the Ministry of Justice. And we set out really clearly in a planning brief that Islington Council did, that we were closely involved with, that we expect 50% to be what's deliverable on that site, and certainly if it's the benefit from the Mayor's fast track route, that's what it would have to achieve. So that's public land where there are no homes. So there are plenty of sites coming forward, as we see with TfL sites as well, as we see with lots of different public sector landowners, where there aren't existing homes on it. So the threshold approach, the fast track route applies in those cases. On the cases where you have some form of estate regeneration, where you have existing homes being demolished and rebuilt, we're saying that the 50% threshold is not relevant there, because you can't have a fast track route. It has to be viability tested. It has to maximise the amount of affordable housing delivered. So it could be a lot more than 50% if that's viable on the scheme. But the point is that the threshold, the fast track route, does not apply to estate regeneration.
Right, now I'm thinking of a different policy here, which is not, here we go, policy H5, which says delivering affordable housing, part 3 and part 4 both cite a 50% target on public sector land. Those I mean, they're not to do with the viability route, they're just targets, but are they net or gross targets?
As I say, I mean, the strategic target of 50% would apply across public sector land.
Yeah, parts 3 and 4.
3 and 4.
What policy is this? This is H5.
H5.
Taking 6 months.
Yes. So this is investment rather than planning policy, because it's saying if you look at 3 and 4, it's affordable housing providers with agreements with the mayor. So it does get into the question of funding. So I suggest, should we get back to you with some
well, 4 doesn't
around
mention funding. That's just a target.
And I've just been so all of the planning targets, well, all of the planning measures of affordable housing are measured in net terms in the annual monitoring report.
Yes.
So that will be published every year, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but are you? We'll need to clear this up, because the question of whether you're expecting 50% gross or 50% net makes a big difference to how far you're going towards the really high targets in the SMART, which say, 65% of homes ought to be affordable if we're meeting London's needs.
I'm not clear what do you mean by gross and net, because normally they're used in the terms of a net figure is where you take account of demolitions, replace the demolitions, and have a net increase.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
But it would always be a net figure. So if on that piece of public land there are existing dwellings and they were demolished, to get a net uplift, they would have to take account of the demolished dwellings and replace them.
In terms of the number of homes, but the affordable split, is that the split in net homes or the split in what you end up with growth? It's about the affordability split within that. That's the question.
The policy applies to a planning application, so it would be the number of homes that are being replaced in the application. So it wouldn't, which we would expect to take account of the demolition of homes. But the 50% would be 50% of the total number of homes in the planning application, because this is a policy for a planning application. So if the planning application is proposing 100 homes, we would expect 50% of those to be affordable.
Right. So if there are, say, like my example with 200 homes, that would then be 25% net gain in affordable homes.
No, because
to
if
contribute
there's
towards the
social
SMART.
homes,
But I think the reason why this is tricky, but it's important
Talk
to
to me if
emphasise.
you replace a home, you don't count it.
Thank you, Nikki. That makes it very clear.
It's always been that.
Can we use a specific example to illustrate this? Can I use the example of the High Path estate, where there's 500 homes, and the original plans put in by one of the precursor organisations that has now become Clarion was to build 1,000 homes, and essentially it was just to replace the 500 homes that were there, and then produce another 500 homes, almost all, if not all, for sale. They've now extended that to 1,800 homes, but there's still only going to be 500 homes that will be replacing the original social rented homes. So I don't see that as a net gain at all, because all the other properties are all going to be sold off to people who will buy them. Now, they might then be using the money that they get from those sales to cross-subsidise 2 other sites, Ravensbury and Eastfields, as it so happens, but I mean, the detail is unimportant. I think the question that we're trying to get to is, where are we going to see that gain? And, on sites like that, we won't.
The planning has always planning's figures, the monitoring on planning permissions and so on, and on completions has always been net. Includes conversions though, if you create more households. The DCLG figures have usually been gross.
but in that example you were using, they would go through the viability tested route, so we would be scrutinising about why they couldn't provide additional affordable housing in addition to replacing the existing affordable.
I was going to say, I think because actually, I think where this is, if I'm understanding the different points correctly, I think there's one question around how things are monitored and how they're monitored in relation to the London Plan and in terms of funding, and they are slightly different in the way that they're monitored, and we can set that out in detail in writing for you. That would be helpful. But the other point is around the 50% affordable housing public sector land. That does not apply to estate regenerations, because every single application for an estate regeneration would have to go through a full viability testing to make sure the affordable housing is maximised.
Yes.
So
you'll get the most.
70% would be like a hospital site, for example.
Yes.
Yes.
So
it is about monitoring, because the key thing is your viability route is intended to get the most possible affordable homes out of the scheme. But in terms of how you report that, are you going to report that as 50% or 25%, depending on whether it's net or gross? That makes a difference in terms of monitoring your progress towards achieving the needs that are in the SMART.
So as I say, I think there are 2 issues here. One is around the monitoring, which, as I say, because there are differences between how things are recorded and monitored in relation to the London Plan versus funding and so on. Can I suggest we set that out really clearly in writing to you about how those are separately recorded? I think the separate issue around 50% and estate regeneration is that it is easy to understand from the point of view of individual applications coming forward. So if you have any application coming forward for an estate regeneration, it doesn't matter who the landowner is, doesn't matter if that landowner has an agreement about 50% or whatever they have, that application for that estate regeneration will go through viability tested route to ensure the maximum level of affordable housing is delivered. So irrespective of all of the other points, that is nonetheless the case. The point that is being made by H5 is a more general point, which is where public sector landowners are bringing forward public sector land. The Mayor expects them to hit 50% across their portfolios. There is provision within the threshold approach whereby if it's 50% across the portfolio, some of these sites could deliver, for instance, 35% and still benefit from the fast track route if other ones in the portfolio are, let's say, 100%, so they make up the 50% overall, to allow people some flexibility within their overall programmes. But even if you had a public sector landowner who had that agreement with the Mayor, and then that public sector landowner brought forward an estate regeneration, that estate regeneration would have to be viability tested.
Yeah. So the important thing is that we see all the numbers and we can examine this for ourselves.
And a really important guarantee, I think for people more generally, is this guarantee around estate regeneration and around making sure that all of the applications are viability tested. So if the public sector landowner, in this case it would be a council in the example which we're talking about, if a council had an agreement with the Mayor about 50% across their portfolio, if they brought forward an estate regeneration, that would then be viability tested. That wouldn't be subject to any thresholds or fast track, because the fast track and thresholds don't apply.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much. Tom now has more questions about the threshold approach.
So I did have another question on the split. Sorry, the
Go for it,
supportability split. No, I was just wondering because previously the London plan set out originally 70-30 and then 60-40 social or low cost rent to intermediate. Why are you now? Why are you being less prescriptive now with the boroughs?
So there are sort of two important points to make here. Firstly, if you start from the SHMAR, so the needs assessment, it does show obviously the need for affordable housing, but also within that the need is primarily for low-cost rented housing. When we're doing the targets in the plan, that has to take into consideration deliverability, available funding and so on. The funding deal that we secured with government for the current time period up to 2021 is weighted in favour of low-cost home ownership, because that's the deal that we managed to strike with government, given their priorities and accommodating ours as far as possible. So the leaning in terms of funding is toward more low-cost home ownership. And part of the reason for allowing some flexibility within the London plan threshold approach is so that individual boroughs can determine, they have a bit of flexibility within the 35%. So it's a combination of having a clear sort of central steer, around 35% being important, or 50% on public land being important for the fast track approach, but giving boroughs some flexibility around the exact 10 years within there, which they can make a decision on based on local needs, local preferences, viability, and so on. The fallback position is that if the local borough doesn't have a particular view on what that 40% should be, the presumption is toward social rent, London affordable rent. That's where we think things should go.
I mean, the previous, I think the previous mayor's deal, the housing deal from the government was weighted in favour of low-cost home ownership as well, and they still went with a 60-40 split.
But I think what James is saying is that the current government's weighting is not towards low-cost home ownership; it's towards not towards low-cost rent. It's towards.
Yes, but sorry, was the previous deal on affordable housing from the government, the last mayor, was that weighted towards?
Overall, it was still weighted because it's kind of a legacy of the big push for social rent and then affordable rent under the kind of previous Labour government and the beginning of the coalition government.
But on this, I mean, as I say, it says in the text, the supporting text at 4.7.2, the presumption is that 40% provided by the borough will focus on social rent. But could that be included in the actual policy itself, so it's actually got some weight?
I mean, I can take that point back, and we can get back to you on the reason why it's in supporting text rather than in the box.
Yeah, I think that would be really useful to know, because if that is the presumption, then I guess it ought to be in the policy.
Policy.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll move on to my question, which is on the threshold approach. Obviously, it's still early days, but do you think the threshold approach is working, and what evidence do you have either way?
Do I think it's working? Yes. One interesting anecdote, just to start off my explanation, is that even before we had published the draft supplementary planning guidance, we were hearing anecdotally that developers were putting in bids for land on the basis of delivering 35% affordable housing. So they'd already priced that into their bids for land, which meant that the discussions or arguments further downstream around affordable housing were going to be reduced substantially, because they'd already factored that in when they were buying the land up front. And that's really one of the key aims of the threshold approach, is to increase the level of affordable housing and to do it in a way that shifts the cost of affordable housing onto land values, so that we don't have the situation whereby what we've inherited is that land values going up and up and up because of very weak requirements around affordable housing meant that developers were effectively overpaying for land and then coming back and arguing for viability for very low levels of affordable housing. It was a circular argument to very few people's benefit, and so we said, look, this can't go on. We want to make sure that people have a clear steer on affordable housing, so that when the land is being bought, people expect to deliver a minimum level of affordable housing. And the feedback from the industry generally is that they welcome it, because it gives, as in the development industry, because it gives them some clarity, so that when they're bidding for land, they know on what basis they can do that. They like the certainty, they like the fact it's less risky, they like the fact that they can then potentially have a more kind of straightforward conversation with local planning authorities rather than confrontational from the beginning. In terms of boroughs, many boroughs are supportive of our policy. I think that some people argue it should be a little bit lower, some argue it should be a bit higher, but I think everyone acknowledges this is a much better position than we inherited.
And within the 35%, without wanting to just go back to tenure split, within that 35%, do you have any evidence as to whether developers are going with the sort of desired tenure split within the new draft London plan, or are we in a situation where they're getting up to 35% by just putting in a load of shared ownership and ignoring the low-cost rent side?
So in terms of the applications which are referable to the Mayor, we've been very clear that we do not, in normal circumstances, accept a 35% fast-track approach if it's mono-tenure. There may be certain cases where that's, you look at the specifics of the situation and it might be a different conclusion, but the starting point is always that it should be a mix. So you should have rented housing as well as low-cost home ownership. That should always be the presumption. And that is largely what we are seeing. And the people are following a tenure split. They look to the local borough to see what the tenure split is the local borough is likely to support. So you see slightly different weightings depending on what the borough's local preferences are in terms of rent versus low-cost home ownership. But we are seeing developers coming forward with the 35% routinely, and when they do so, they are having a mix of rented and low-cost home ownership.
And are you planning on doing any, at some point, doing any sort of quantitative work to so that we can say for sure? I mean, you've spoken anecdotally about the applications coming through. Do you intend at some point to do some sort of work to actually look overall to see if there has been an increase in, if it is working?
Yes.
Excellent. Do you know when, or when would be a sensible period to?
I can get back to you exactly when. It might make sense.
Great.
But yes, we can.
Can we ask Tower Hamlets?
Yeah, I was going to bring the boroughs in, Nicky. I was interested. Well, Tower Hamlets and then Havering. What's your view on this?
Can I just ask that that goes back to the entire council?
Sorry.
You said that you get back to Assemblyman Copley on your plans for doing a quantitative analysis.
Yes, please let us all know that, if that's okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the whole committee. Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, our view would be we very much support the threshold approach. I think it is still quite early days to demonstrate what it's achieving. So I can't give you numbers that we've achieved through that approach to date.
So it's too early to say.
Yeah, I mean, we support it. We think it will work. We haven't got the evidence to prove it at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, from a Havering perspective, I mean, we welcome it. We need to be more consistent on how this is applied. I think there is a level of inconsistency. We are still seeing a number of developers overpaying for land and coming forward with a weak argument of maybe I can't deliver any affordable, or 5% or 10% or 11%. And even our own internal viability assessments, I think sometimes are questionable. The skills to carry out these things, I think the capacity to carry out the viability assessments is an issue. And of course it holds up development as well, which everyone's trying to see happen as well. So I think if there was a more consistent approach taken across London, so all developers knew exactly how they'll be measured from a viability point of view, I think that would be very helpful.
Have you sought any advice from the mayors?
We have.
Yeah.
We have. We work very closely with the GLA and James' team in relation to try to get that support to make sure we can increase our ability to push back with some of the developers who are coming forward with substandard levels of affordable housing.
To that end, we recently met with Julie Emma McLaughlin, Head of Planning at GLA, and she was explaining to us that one of the things she's doing is expanding the viability team.
Excellent.
And looked to be able to offer that as a resource to the boroughs, which I think picks up on Steve's points, that potentially it's a very helpful way forward.
Good.
Good. Pleased to hear that. Nick, did you want to come on this point?
It's not that point. It's at the earlier point.
Okay. So
in your, it's okay.
I'll sorry, do I have to finish? Okay, fine. Yeah. And what about the extension of the 35% to other areas? So it's being extended to build to rent, I think. Is there any evidence as to the impact it's having? It will have on that?
So with build to rent, because it's fairly new, I think there's sort of open question around what are the components within 35% for build to rent, which means that people do actually use the build to rent threshold sometimes. Sorry, as in the 35% threshold sometimes. Because you could set a definition of what that 35% had to include, which would be so impossible to deliver that actually no one would use it, and so the threshold approach wouldn't really be, wouldn't be worth having. Or you could set it at a level where the affordability wasn't good enough, in which case you'd be missing out on too much potential gain for Londoners as a result of the threshold. So getting the definition of the components of the threshold is really important for the success of this measure. And when you're talking about traditional, conventional home building, where it's a combination of social rent and usually shared ownership, people understand the parameters of it a little better, so people can specify what they want. Please, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but Tower Hamlet says 70% at social rent levels, 30% can be intermediate. That sums up to 35%, and you're happy that that's a decent amount of affordable housing to get from a scheme. So that would be an example where people kind of know the parameters of it. In build to rent, I think people don't know the parameters yet because it's still quite early on. So in the supplementary planning guidance, we didn't set a threshold approach for build to rent. We just said it should all be viability tested, with the view being that over time we could see what was coming through on viability tested schemes, and then possibly in the future say, oh, well, this is where things seem to be landing. This is how we could set out a threshold approach for build to rent. What we decided to do in the draft London plan is to set out an initial threshold approach for build to rent, which is the 35%, but then including homes at London living rent for at least 30% of those homes. And that's one way of saying, let's test this, let's see how this works, let's see if this threshold is appropriate. Obviously the London plan can be updated and parts of it can be amended, so we can see if this works and if this needs to be amended in any particular way. But I think it would be good to get to a situation where you could have a functioning threshold for build to rent, but I think the exact components of that threshold are still being teased out.
Okay. Yeah. Any more on that?
I was just going to say that beyond build to rent, Tom, your question implies is right that the threshold is also proposed to be applied in the plan to student housing, retirement housing and shared living housing as well. And I think the same goes for all of those, which is because it wasn't in the SPG, it's almost impossible to kind of say that they've had a big impact yet because they've only just been introduced and they don't have kind of that much weight in the system yet.
Okay. I've got a sort of final question on minimum space standards and permitted development and co-living. Obviously, I don't think it's possible for the Mayor to apply minimum space standards for permitted development, but co-living, potentially, you could apply minimum space standards for new co-living developments. Is there any reason why you don't, and is that something you should consider?
So, as you rightly say, within co-living, there's more flexibility around space standards than within conventional housing. And I think by defining large-scale purpose-built shared living, or co-living for short, very, very precisely, it's an attempt to make sure that any flexibility around space standards stands no chance at all of impacting on conventional supply. So conventional supply has absolutely firm guidance around space standards and about room standards, which is new in this London plan. So it's really very firm indeed around the space standards for conventional supply, whilst allowing flexibility in very tightly defined circumstances around this co-living. Again, with co-living, because it's quite new, it's still a question of seeing developments coming forward and seeing how they, what the right kind of levels are. And a lot of that feedback is at the moment being given via individual planning applications. So when an application comes to the Mayor, he'll look at it, we'll look at it and discuss it with him, and he'll say, actually, these look on too much on the small side. That's not the right side of the slightly grey line in terms of what the space standard should be in terms of co-living. I mean, in terms of what might happen in future as the sector develops more, obviously all policy can be updated, but at the moment it's a way of allowing co-living to have a place in London's housing supply, but any flexibility to be completely ring-fenced so it doesn't affect conventional supply in any way.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of the Mayor, say, declining an application on a co-living scheme on the basis that the rooms are too small, if the standards don't apply, what weight can he put on that?
I think that, at the moment, because it's so new, it would be very hard to pick an exact number and say this is the exact number right now. But looking at each individual application on a case-by-case basis, he can give a very clear steer that is simply too small, and having made an assessment of it, he doesn't support that level of room size.
Sure, but if a developer then comes back and says, well, we're going to do it anyway, if there's nothing in the, if the standards don't apply, or there isn't a separate set of standards that apply, I mean, is it going to be more difficult for him to reject an application on that basis than for it to stand up?
I mean, the mayor can reject it on the basis he considers the rooms to be too small. It would be up to the developer if they want to appeal that, clearly. That would be an option open to them. But the mayor can reject an application because he doesn't consider the space standards to be adequate.
There's also a sort of bigger factor of co-living in terms of the whole offer of the whole building, about what else they're offering, because it's a very small development, but they often offer other things, and that's often what the mayor looks like in terms of what the overall package is that's being offered for the development, rather than just the size of the room. Because in a self-contained accommodation, obviously, you expect that there's space in there for the other things you'd expect to be provided as part of self-contained accommodation. With co-living, there are things like laundries, there are often shared living rooms, there are large kitchens, and those kind of things all add into the assessment of whether or not it's a suitable environment for living.
So you can have a very, very... I don't understand this, because the whole co-living, what you're sharing is the communal space usually, isn't it? Or not everyone wants a spare bedroom or something. What is it that's... Where are you squeezing the space standards there?
Well, it's about like the number of people sharing the kitchen, the number of people sharing that living space, how many, the kind of environment they're living in. Potentially, and that's what the mayor looks at in terms of referred applications. So it isn't just about the size of the room,
So
it is what other things are being provided.
It's not about smaller space standards, it's about larger ones.
I think it's just difficult to have space standards where you're talking about the space standards for other uses in a building, because co-living isn't just about a bedroom, it's about co-living.
Sure. But what we
which you don't have in a self-contained accommodation.
Well, just clarifying, this policy is about non-self-contained. So yes. We had a situation before where there were lots of schemes coming in, and it wasn't always clear whether they were non-self-contained kind of co-living, or self-contained very small flats, kind of micro flats, or built to rent, or student housing, and there's quite a lot of blurring between all of those, actually, and probably retirement housing as well. And what we attempted to do in the plan is distinguish those very clearly and define them to make sure that we were capturing the benefits in every case, for example, affordable housing for co-living. And in some cases, such as micro flats, so self-contained very small flats, they're effectively ruled out by the plan because the space standards always apply to self-contained accommodation. So what we've done is kind of very clearly distinguish between different uses.
And that's partly to the point around making sure that the flexibility is contained within this very tight definition of co-living, rather than in any way risking bleeding out into the wider supply.
And the policy support for co-living is quite tentative actually in the plan. So in H18A it says large-scale purpose-built share living, co-living may have a role in meeting housing need. And effectively what the policy says is if it meets these very tight criteria, then it may be permissible to have some flexibility on housing standards. But as James says, it's kind of very tentative at this stage because it's quite a new sector and we want to see what it looks like.
Another question?
Very quick question. It's going back to the earlier part of Tom's question. I think, James, you were saying that, and I agree with this, what's good about the 35% threshold is that it gives certainty in advance, so it will impact, therefore, on land speculation. Now, yesterday, in the Planning Committee, we had an issue around land speculation because there's no ceiling, there's no maximum, there's no density matrix, and there's no ceiling on density. And there was a strong feeling that this would lead to land speculation. And if you're looking at a mixed tenure site, which you would be doing, I think often with the threshold you would be, then how are you going to deal with that aspect of it?
Well, I might bring James in a second for some further detail, but I think it's important to recognise that although there were the guidelines for densities in the previous London plan, they were very often exceeded, and so in fact there were people already buying land on the basis of delivering at higher densities, and so
you could do something about that in this plan. But you haven't.
Well, what we're saying is in every density on each individual scheme should be optimised. that design should be, good design should be integral to bringing forward that planning application, and that it must include the 35% affordable housing. So one of the biggest determinants around the land value is going to be affordable housing. If you're building at higher density, if you're managing to optimise density above what you might have done under another scenario, you are delivering more affordable housing because you are delivering 35% of whatever you're delivering. So even if you're building at higher density with more units on it, the 35% applies to a greater number of units. So you are getting more affordable housing out of it. And I think the phrasing around optimising density is really important because sometimes we know that for very tall buildings, the viability can actually be more expensive to build some very tall buildings in certain circumstances. And so actually building a different form might be a better way of making sure people can meet the 35% threshold. James, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just distinguish between the policy objective for affordable housing, which is about maximising affordable housing. So in that case, it makes sense to set a minimum and let that feed into land values. Compare that with density, where the policy objective is to optimise rather than minimise or maximise, if that makes sense. Which means putting kind of numbers in a plan and enforcing those rigidly doesn't make sense because that isn't what the policy objective is. In some cases, it will make sense to have higher densities, and in some cases, it might make sense to have lower densities. And if you sit that alongside the point that James made around how the matrix in the current plan is very rarely kind of stuck to in terms of individual applications, we not only get a lot of applications above, but also I think 25% come up, 15% also come under the density matrix. So it's clearly not being applied in a kind of North American planning style.
Benchmark.
Yeah.
Can
I don't want to go
guillotine this conversation at this point because we promised not to discuss density at this meeting because the planning committee discussed it yesterday and it's a very, very big topic. We do have an interest though. Can we move on though to the next topic, which is the size mix of homes, and Andrew's going to lead on that because that's very much of interest to us.
Mr. Murray, can you explain why the strategic housing market assessment assesses more than half of London's need to be for one-bedroom homes?
So the SHMAR, and just to be clear, in case this comes up, the SHMAR is not policy. The SHMAR is evidence base on which policy is then made. As you rightly say, the SHMAR does identify there to be a large need for 1 and 2 bedroom homes, and there are a number of reasons around that. Changes to the underlying population and household projections. There are assumptions made around under-occupation and also the need to accommodate concealed households. So, for instance, people who might be living in overcrowding at the moment, where the overcrowding is relieved via 1 or 2 people, for instance, moving out of that home into a smaller home. So, for a number of different reasons, the SHMAR identifies that large need for 1 and 2 bedroom homes. I think what we've got to remember is the starting point, which is that the SHMAR sets out how you would provide the housing that everyone needs to ensure the housing needs are met, i.e. there's no overcrowding. If you build all the homes identified in the SHMAR, that might be through a combination of some larger homes, but clearly a large number of 1 and 2 bedroom homes as well. As I said, down to the reasons around the changes in the population, assumptions around occupation, and the need for smaller homes to accommodate concealed households. So those factors mean that there is that larger numerical need identified in the SHMAR for 1 and 2 bedroom homes, but as I say, policy is separate than the evidence base.
How reliable are the SHMAR assessments, given that they're based on the English Housing Survey sample of only 2,000 Londoners?
The SHMAR is based on a number of different sources. James, I don't know if you want to comment about the evidence base?
We generally say it's the best estimate we can make with the available data, and there's not really anything else we can do about that. So, I think you're right, the English Housing Survey is not a larger sample as we would have liked, but across the whole of London and over a reasonably long time period. So we don't only look at 1 year, we'll look at 2 or 3 years for the EHS. It gives us a kind of confident enough estimate. We could always have better data, but we have to also do the assessment with the data that's available to us.
You've rightly identified that SHMAR is not policy, but it's just a piece of evidence. But the SHMAR doesn't actually weigh, and similarly, that piece of evidence doesn't value to put any particular weight of value on any particular housing need. So it judges, or it doesn't judge at all, but the needs of, say, 4 students who are occupying a larger house for a couple of years is considered exactly the same and neutral to a family being brought up in overcrowded conditions. There is no value or weight put on any of that need. Is that correct?
That is exactly where policy in the London Plan and in local boroughs comes in. So the SHMAR identifies in a analytical sense over a long time period without any judgments being made on any other basis. What homes would you need to meet all of the need over that time period? The plan policy and then local borough policy can then add in further steers. So for instance, for the first time, the draft London Plan allows boroughs to set guidance around the size mix of units for low-cost rent. So you can say within social rented homes, for instance, a borough might say they want particularly family-sized housing or whatever steer they gave. That reflects the fact that although over the long term, the SHMAR analysis period, you would need, as you say, a particular number of 1 and 2 beds, which is set out within that SHMAR. A local borough can say there is a pressing need, for instance, for social rented homes for families, and so that will be prioritised within the local plan. And this London Plan, draft London Plan, for the first time enables boroughs to do that.
You said that at my previous housing committee, when we were considering the draft housing strategy and raised concerns about the loss of a family homes target, you assured us that this will be addressed in the London Plan. It doesn't seem to have been addressed. It seemed to have been abnegated.
No, so the London Plan is very clear in that this London Plan, for the first time, requires boroughs to provide guidance on the size mix of low-cost rented homes based on local factors like overcrowding. So that's something which this London Plan does, which previous London Plans have not. Neither the current draft housing strategy nor the previous mayors included a separate target for family-sized housing. Steers about family housing have only ever been given through funding guidance.
There was a target in the housing strategy for the previous mayor.
Now
you've got no targets anyway.
There was an aspiration in the previous mayor's funding guidance.
And we saw the number of larger properties increase over his period.
The target that the previous mayor set was not a target. It was an aspiration for funding bids. And if you actually look at the detail of his funding guidance, it said that there should be a certain number of family-sized homes. They should only apply to discounted rent homes, which was only half of the affordable rent homes under the previous mayor's approach to funding guidance. It was only ever an aspiration for funding bids. It was never a separate target within the housing strategy, and certainly not anything within the London Plan.
It had a policy. Can you point in the London Plan where the mayor identifies how important overcrowding is as a social problem in London?
The basis of the SHMAR, the evidence base for the housing targets, is based on overcrowding being addressed. So the entire...
We go back to the original thing, that it applies no value, it applies no difference between the different needs.
It's an aspiration.
It's aspiration. As I say, 4 students living on Mile End Road, overcrowded for a little while, are considered exactly the same as a family that's been brought up for their entire young lives in overcrowded conditions.
And
there's no value.
So let me set this out really clearly for you. The SHMAR is calculated on the basis of everyone's needs being met, right? Yeah. So just starting from that point of view, you're right in that the SHMAR is analytical and it doesn't make those extra judgments, but it is, and from an analytical basis, the entire underpinning of the housing targets is around eliminating overcrowding. Okay, so the issue of overcrowding is absolutely in the foundations of the SHMAR, which is in the evidence base for the London Plan policy. When you then come to the London Plan policies itself around unit size mix, it's really important to see the distinction between market housing and low-cost rented, social rented housing, because in market housing, we know that in practice, a lot of family-sized accommodation, what you might call family-sized accommodation, 3-bed plus, are in fact bought by investors and then rented, so they don't go to families. And it is the case that 2/3 of market homes, which are family size, actually don't have any children living there. They're lived in by individuals, couples, or adult sharers. So prioritising family size housing or 3-bed plus housing within the market sector would not necessarily go toward meeting family need. Whereas, if you just let me finish this point, whereas within the social rented sector or low-cost rented sector, councils can have housing registers and make sure that those homes do actually go to those people whose needs are being targeted most directly. So if a local borough sets a target for low-cost rented housing for a particular number of 3-bedroom plus homes to be brought forward, they can then make sure they are used by families.
For your own categorisation, where in the London plan is there a policy related to removing overcrowding amongst those people who live in affordable housing?
So it's very clear that when it says the individual boroughs can specify the size mix for low-cost rented homes, that can be based on local factors such as the rate of overcrowding.
And consider overcrowding a London-wide problem?
It's a London-wide problem, which is why it is part of the
If it's a London-wide problem, why doesn't it have a London-wide expression?
It has a London-wide expression in that boroughs across London are encouraged to set size mix requirements for low-cost rented housing based on factors that would include overcrowding. Individual boroughs can see their local evidence and what they know about their housing needs assessment within their local borough and set the appropriate size mixes.
Are there boroughs without any overcrowding problem?
No, I don't think there are.
Okay. Without targets for new family housing, what incentive is there for developers to build larger new homes?
Sorry, say that again?
Without targets for family housing, and we've talked about your affordability targets, the 35% earlier, which you decide to impose London-wide, why haven't you got targets for new family housing? And if you haven't got a target, what's the incentive for developers to build those homes?
So individual boroughs are required to set guidance around the size mix for low-cost rented homes. So there will be those targets for low-cost rented homes. What we're saying is that we want those targets around the size mix, which could include family housing, to be focused on low-cost rented homes, not on market housing, which, as we know, for the reasons I just set out, quite often can be bought by investors, let out to sharers and so on, and not actually helping families in need.
How does the new London plan promote downsizing?
Sorry.
How does the new London plan promote downsizing?
So the new London plan, it's setting out what homes we need to build in order to meet everyone's need, and that doesn't assume any downsizing within the market sector, within owner occupation. It doesn't assume any downsizing there. It assumes a degree of downsizing within the social renter sector and the private renter sector, but that is separate. So the owner occupied sector assumes no downsizing. It assumes that under occupation continues at the same rate that currently exists. The way that downsizing can be promoted is by providing the right kind of homes for people to downsize into. So you might have a situation whereby, for instance, a local authority would want to encourage 2-bedroom homes which are ring-fenced for older under-occupiers to downsize into, because that might be a particularly attractive thing for people who are currently living in a 3 or 4-bedroom home to downsize into. So it would allow boroughs the flexibility to set targets around the kind of housing that would be attractive to downsizers. There's also some policy within the London plan around housing which is attractive to older people, not just sheltered or housing delivered with care support, but also more generally housing which is attractive to older people. And I think, again, the idea there is that by providing attractive housing for older people to downsize into, they might voluntarily make that choice.
Do you expect older Londoners to downsize to a 1-bedroom flat?
No. It's very clear that in the SHMA, it's on the basis of people who are in
We've said that SHMA is just a technical assessment. I'm talking about the London plan and how the London plan has translated the SHMA into policies that matter.
The London plan doesn't have any directive around downsizing. It's around providing the homes which will then meet Londoners' needs, and that may involve some downsizing in the social rented sector, or assume some downsizing in the social rented sector or the private rented sector, but not in owner occupation.
So are you just assuming that people will downsize?
No, we're in the owner occupied sector, we're assuming there won't be downsizing on the basis of the SHMA figures.
You talked earlier about some of new housing is about meeting the needs of existing requirements, that it's not all about demand, it's about existing requirements. How many young people are living in overcrowded conditions in London?
Yeah, I can send you the stats around that. I don't think
it's 360,000. Okay. Don't you think that's a problem that's worth addressing by addressing the fact that there is little supply for those families to move to a more appropriate sized property?
So when you have overcrowded families at the moment, there can be a number of different ways in which the overcrowding is caused. It could well be that you have a parent or two parents with young children and they need a larger home, so they might be living in a 1 or a 2 bed and need a 3 or 4 bed. You could have that situation. You could also quite commonly have a situation where the children are adults themselves, but still living at home because they're unable to afford somewhere to move out into. So in that situation, you might have overcrowding, let's say in a 2-bed home, and what the family needs to relieve each individual's overcrowding is not necessarily a 3 or a 4-bedroom home, but maybe 2 2-bedroom homes, or a 2-bed and a 1-bed, or some combination along those lines, because overcrowding can be caused by adult children living at home as well as children under the age where they're still dependent.
It isn't the same kind of overcrowding.
It's completely different.
It isn't the same kind of overcrowding. If you've already been growing up in a home with, and the 2 of you in 1 bedroom, but you're in a private rented flat, they're sort of children sleeping with their parents.
It's too late.
So it's different.
But with respect to that, the point I was making, and that the solution is different, in that if you have, let's say, a family living in a social rented property and there are dependent young children, then the solution may well be a larger home for that family to move into. If you have a situation where a family is living in social rented accommodation and the children are all adults themselves, the right solution might not be for everyone to move into a larger family home, but to split into separate households, so that you have a larger number of smaller properties for them all to live in. That was the point I was making.
Sure. Okay, I misunderstood your point. I'm sorry, James.
And of course, many communities in London, there's a requirement for larger properties, not splitting up the family, because many families support each other, different, intergenerational support, and they tend to live in the same home. And yet those houses aren't coming forward, are they? Those 5-bedroom, those 6-bedroom houses, I'm not asking for every single development to be 5 or 6 bedrooms, but those 5 or 6 bedroom developments just simply aren't happening.
But I think what you're actually highlighting here is the difference that you can have across London, and local boroughs should be able to understand what their needs are specifically in terms of size and the size mix of homes.
There's no incentive, is there, Mr. Murray, for people to build those homes if it's not in the housing strategy and then it's not in the London plan? It means you're not going to pay for them and you're not going to even advise them to build them.
It is in the draft London plan. The draft London plan says the borough should set requirements around the size mix of locals rented homes. If we have, maybe I don't want to put a borough on the spot, but if Tower Hamlets, it might be worth. I can suggest it might be worth, for instance, asking Tower Hamlets.
We will come to the boroughs in a moment.
I'm going to move on to the boroughs. Yes, don't worry. But don't you see the point that if the out of 750,000 words in the London plan, and there is only one reference to overcrowded homes, aren't developers going to say, well, it's not that important here? I remember going up to Manchester one time and asking the chief exec there, we were on a trip about the Olympic Park many years ago, and I said to the chief exec there, I said, what are you doing about your overcrowding in Manchester? And he said, what overcrowding? This affects London more than any other area of the country. And yet we have one reference to it in the London plan, and we have a housing strategy that doesn't attach any kind of funding whatsoever to building those very important larger homes. Do you understand the concerns of this assembly when it sees a London plan and a housing strategy that virtually says it's not our problem?
What I cannot understand is why my explanation to you doesn't seem to be clear enough, because I'm being very, very clear in that for the first time, the draft London plan sets out a requirement of boroughs to set out how many homes of different sizes they want in low-cost rented housing. That is where we are able to build housing to tackle overcrowding. That's why the London plan has the clearest hook for boroughs to set out what their size mix requirements of new homes, and it's for the first time included in this draft London plan. So I'm afraid I don't
There's
quite
no
understand.
numbers, no targets, and no real expression in the London plan of how important this problem is.
It's there because in the primary policy around what the mix should be of low-cost rented housing, it says boroughs should set expectations around what their size mix requirements are. It is something which was not in previous London plans. It is for the first time saying the boroughs should give a steer about what size mix they want for low-cost rented housing, specifically to tackle issues including overcrowding. And it mentions that they're in black and white.
What also in black and white is that the London plan saying that 2-bedrooms units should be taken into account when assessing the need for family homes. Do you think Londoners living in overcrowded positions, overcrowded homes, will consider a 2-bedroom flat a family home?
It depends on the need of that individual family.
If that's what you can meet, if that's what you can justify, if you say, oh, I'm going to build family homes and they're going to be 2-bedroom flats.
It depends what a family needs. You can't generalise about what a family might need. You might have a parent with one child and they do need a 2-bed.
You've got to provide for them. You've got to identify that need and you've got to cope with that.
And that's what individual boroughs are able to do. You might well have a family where you have a parent with a child and they need a 2-bedroom home.
Can I ask, perhaps, Havering, how you consider...
Sorry, yes, I have Tom and Leonie both waiting to ask questions.
I'm so sorry.
Because I really want to hear from the boroughs on this, but do you have follow-ups for Joe?
So first of all, as Andrew's just raised it on the 2-bed family house, I just think I can sort of see what you're trying to say, but I think it's not coming across the way that it's intended. It feels like it's almost justifying overcrowding, which I'm sure is not your intention. I know that's not your intention, but that's how it comes across. And I just think that anything that could possibly suggest that people, I suspect most families living in 2-bed, accommodations potentially are overcrowded. So I would hope that wording could be taken out or revised somewhat in the subsequent plan. But on the
make a note of that point.
Thank you. That'd be great. On the subject of, just some of I know the SMAR is evidence and not policy, but for example, according to the SMAR, we need half the number of 3- and 4-bed low-cost rented homes each year as we do market rent homes, which seems quite counterintuitive. I take your point about not setting prescriptive size mixes for market rents on the basis that they're often bought by investors and rented out to individuals rather than families. But that doesn't mean at some point in the future they won't be lived in by a family. They won't, they might be sold on. We don't know. I know the plan period is 5 years, but the SMAR is over 25 years, and over those 25 years. You've got much more flexibility with a 3- or 4-bedroom property than you do with a 1-bedroom property. So has that been taken into consideration?
So the SMAR, although the example I gave around larger homes being bought and then rented out to sharers is one driver of the policy. It's also significant about the underlying household projections. About the formation of more smaller households over time, and so it's also the need for 1 or 2 beds. It's not just based on the issue which you just discussed around multiple sharers living in larger homes. It's also based on what the underlying households are, and actually, if you have a household of 1 or 2 people, having them living in a home which is around the right size for their need. And maybe better than them sharing perpetuity. So I think you can argue both ways.
What's next?
One last point, which is specifically on low cost rent, where I do really think you need to have some sort of target. I know you said it actually wasn't in the housing strategy previously. It was the funding guidance. But we had David Montague at this committee, and he said very clearly to us that they would be building that their focus would be on 1 or 2 beds, and I suppose from their point of view that is what they will deliver. The 60,000 grant rate is the same whether or not you're building, I think, a 1-bed or a 4-bed. So obviously the incentive for them is to build smaller units. Surely that makes it even more important for there to be a strategic target in the plan, not just leaving it up to boroughs, having a strategic London-wide target, which is going to encourage housing associations to build these larger units?
Well, I think as you rightly highlighted, there has, in the London plan before, there has never been a target for family housing. And so for the first time, we're saying, particularly on that low-cost rented housing, where the size mix really matters in terms of tackling issues like overcrowding, we are giving a steer that we should require boroughs to provide guidance on that for low-cost rented homes. And so I think...
But you, in some parts of the plan, you're very prescriptive on boroughs, and in other parts of the plan, it's sort of very hands-off. And I'm wondering sort of almost where the logic is in something as important as this, not having a figure that the mayor says is important.
I think the truth is that it will vary from borough to borough around what their housing needs are. And I think that we expect boroughs, that's why the plan is quite clear about requiring boroughs to provide this guidance. We do expect boroughs to work out what the needs are of their local population living in social rented housing and make sure that they are setting clear planning policy around what kind of homes are needed.
Leonie, do you have a question? I don't think how much longer we can wait before we hear from the boroughs on this. Like, we can carry on arguing forever.
Yes,
but
I do.
Can we get their views as soon as possible?
Just ask a technical question.
No, I think we should move on
I've put mine
hear
up a
from
long
them.
time ago.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mine is also about the mix of sizes of homes, but partially coming from the other end, which is I think Andrew started with the comments about the SHMA and this assessment that we need lots and lots of one beds. And you've then said, but in the real world, we're not really assuming that, and a lot of that need is being driven by older people who are possibly in properties that they're under-occupying. And there is, and I do have a big concern about fuel poverty for people who are, knocking around in places that are simply too large for them. But you actually just said that we don't really expect them to downsize to one beds. So if we're not expecting them to downsize to one beds, hopefully we're then going to completely ignore that part of the SHMA that says that we need lots of one beds. My concern is also partly driven by some historical evidence where we ended up 89-90, just as Myras was being removed by the government, with builders all over London shoving up thousands of blocks of flats with lots and lots of one beds. Myras was then removed. There was then this massive overhang, and the government rode in, as they have not done for Carillion, to help all these poor builders, because obviously most building companies, are very impoverished and do deserve government assistance, brackets not, and invented the housing market package, and then got housing associations to buy really poor quality blocks that contained lots and lots of one-bedroom flats. Now, that was also because people were getting into trouble with their mortgages because they'd, in some cases, had bought places that were then worth half what they'd paid for them and all this sort of thing. And we are seeing a bit of a slump in the housing market here. So I'm really worried about this concept of moving towards the smaller units. I'm coming at it from the other end because I'm wondering who is going to go into them, because I cannot see older people who seem to form the largest number of the new smaller households being interested in them. I've run decant schemes and tried to persuade older people to move out of 3 and 4 bedroom places, and you can't. They do require at least two bedrooms, and apart from anything else, having their children or their grandchildren or carers coming to stay, it's absolutely essential that they have another bedroom so that it then becomes a home for life, and you're not expecting them to move. So I'm hoping that we are going to move more towards 2s, 3s and 4s, but coming at it from the other end. Now, can you guarantee that that is definitely what we're going to see?
So, just to separate out a few of the points there. On the point around downsizing, just to reiterate, the SHMA does not assume any downsizing in the owner-occupied sector. So a lot of that need for 1 and 2 beds would be various factors, but for instance, newly formed households. Assuming particularly the households who are owner-occupying in the medium longer term are less likely to under-occupy than existing households because of the cost of housing. So a newly formed household is more likely to buy a home with a number of bedrooms close to their need, than they might have done a generation ago. It also assumes there may well be some households which are currently concealed, so people living with other people, but actually they want their own home as their own household. So there are new sources of household for those 1 and 2 beds, which does not involve any downsizing from owner-occupiers. In the social rented sector, downsizing is something where I agree, and I say this with my previous hat on. You were much more likely to be able to encourage people to downsize from a 3 or 4 bed to a 2 bed than to a 1 bed. And actually, Tom, when I had the previous job, he came to see a great development of 2 bed homes in a development ring fence for over 55s. And people were very keen to move in there because they were well designed homes for older people. Everyone moving in there freed up a 3 or a 4 bedroom home by building these 20 or 2 bedroom homes in this development. So that's an example there where the local borough would be encouraging the delivery of 2 beds, which would free up a large number of family-sized housing for people on the housing waiting list. So that's actually quite a good example of where you can create more availability in larger family-sized housing by building smaller housing, if it's ring-fenced for downsizers, 2-bed homes, for instance, for people to downsize into.
But it has to be really, really well designed. I mean, I've done the same thing and did a whole set of decants from people into actually a tower block, which young families didn't wish to live in, that was on the edge of town, but converted a couple of the flats on the ground floor to being communal facilities, and then got a lot of people who were previously under occupy to move in. Now, they did have the advantage of having beautiful views of the sea and balconies, but it was really unpopular and had been massively under occupied. Waiting list, as soon as we said it's for people 55 plus. I think reimagining some of what we're doing is really important. But are you really saying then the 1 beds are going to be completely filled by people in these hidden potential households of people in their 20s and 30s and possibly their early 40s who've been unable to move out from living with their parents? Is that what we're saying?
It's not entirely that. It's also new household formation over time. So people who we expect to move to London, people who are growing up in London, people who are forming new households in London. We expect there to be a large number of people requiring 1 or 2 beds over the long time period that the SHMA analyses. I think to your other point around 1 bed developments, lots of 1 beds in one development. I mean, there is actually policy in H12. Generally schemes consisting mainly of 1 bed units should be resisted. So although the SHMA does identify that need for smaller properties, there is nonetheless a very clear steer that developments of 1 beds only should be resisted.
But mainly of 1 beds, I mean, that could mean that one that has 49% 1 beds could be approved, because that's not mainly, that's less than 50%. I mean, I think it's really important to, restrict the number. I just think most people do not want to live in a 1-bedroom flat. Having lived in several 1-bedroom flats myself for many years, I think most, but with very good space standards, I just think it will be an issue for most people at whatever point they are in their life. Anyway, thank you.
Could I perhaps ask the boroughs about these site stamps? One of the things, just to pick up one point that the Deputy Mayor said was that, for instance, a large family might downsize to 2 other properties. How practical is that? Or would you be able to make 2 properties available at the same time to the same family, or would it end up with one going?
Sorry, that's not strictly what I said.
I beg your pardon. I didn't mean to.
I said that you could well have overcrowding in a household, which is relieved by some members of that household moving into a smaller property. Right. So you might have, for instance, in a 2-bed home, you might have more people. You might have a need for more than 2 beds. But that is relieved by, let's say, 1 adult child moving out into a 1-bed.
So, but the remainder of their family staying in the property.
Yeah. So it doesn't always. But the key point there is it doesn't require the initial property to be vacated. It could just mean grown-ups moving out, or family units moving out of household units rather, moving out into new ones.
Really sorry, I misunderstood. On the issue of family-sized housing, of course, we don't know what family-sized is going to mean now, because it could mean 2-bedroom. I might as well make it 1-bedroom for all I care. But it just seems a distortion of what a family-sized home is. How are the boroughs going to deal with this or lack of aspiration for family-sized homes?
So, I mean, it's a very interesting debate, by the way. It's quite interesting from an officer point of view, sitting there and listening to that and understanding some of the conversations around that. Havering isn't out of London Borough, so a lot of the things mentioned with the London plan necessarily is a London-wide SMAR here. So locally, our SMAR in 16-17 identified about 80% of our needs was 3-bed plus. So that's fundamentally different than what's in the London plan. That was 16-17, Martin, wasn't it? Yeah. So that's very, very recent. Again, in London, we'll have a different dynamic.
Let's just go to 80%.
Yes. So that's a key factor for us in looking at need, and of course, it's nigh on impossible to hit that need. We know that, so we try to aspire to that as best we can. I mean, I think there's a real risk with this sometimes. We're talking about numbers and numbers, a very technical discussion around numbers and numbers. I mean, I'm Director of Neighbourhoods for the council, which is Director of Place. So, and the clue sort of in the title, it's looking at people, it's looking wider community and wider community needs and infrastructure. As I've mentioned today, it's just not about housing, and it just doesn't work. If you look at it in isolation, it's about creating the community resilience. So through our regeneration programs, we try to look at opportunities whether they're young 30-something professionals stereotypically, or family accommodation, or people with assisted living needs, have the opportunity to build that into the wider footprint of the regeneration, so people can move around and support the needs. From a community resilience point of view, it's quite critical for us to be able to manage down demand. So that is certainly at the forefront of what we're looking to do as a local authority. I know I said it 2 or 3 times today, but I will say it again. This is really not about building housing. This is about creating good new communities which meets the needs of that population. And if you look at housing in isolation, completely in isolation, then I think it does create challenges and can increase the cost to local authorities. So, as I say, I mean, some of those stats are probably quite surprising for you, but Havering is also...
Actually, they don't surprise me.
So there is a flip side to that. London is moving east, the dynamics are changing. So Havering has been a place, like most outer London boroughs, that has attracted people that have moved out from inner London to outer London to more green spaces, parks, that sort of thing, start families and all that sort of stuff. So historically it has been a place of settlers where people have chosen to move to, primarily from inner parts of East London. That dynamic is changing through welfare reform. There's a lot of people that, from an affordability point of view, are not choosing to move out to Havering. They have no option but to move out to more affordable parts of London. And that chasing along that sort of A13 corridor is going on at the moment. And with that is coming a different demand that we need to adjust to as a local authority, and that needs to factor into our needs going forward, and we need to get more intelligence around what that demographic change is going to bring to the needs over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and working closely with colleagues in the GLA to understand that dynamic and that movement is going to be important.
Yeah.
I think what I've been encouraged about is hearing the Deputy Mayor confirm that providing we have our own local evidence about what is needed in Havering, and it's up to date and relevant and we can support it, then we have a reasonable amount of flexibility and latitude to make sure that our planning policies are aimed at delivering those sorts of units for the benefit of the borough. I think that's encouraging and very positive.
Are you confident that you will be able to resist developers who don't want to put in developments that you don't identify your local need?
That's a really good question, and one I've put a little question mark against here when I was discussing with my colleague earlier on. Developers will play that game. Well, they'll say, well, you might turn it down locally actually, but we'll link it to the London plan actually, and that'll trump you. So that's something we would need to understand a bit more about where that sort of hierarchy does sit, because developers will normally default to London Plan or NPPF in relation to guessing where they want to do eventually. And if it's more financially viable for developers to build one-bedroom apartments than it is family accommodation, that is something that we have to keep a close eye on.
I mean, just to take that point on, we've had an admission from the Mayor the last Mayor's question time that he would turn down developments if the room sizes were too big. Do you see that as a problem if Havering are coming forward and providing homes that are suitable for larger families, and the Mayor says, no, your room sizes are too big? It's never been in the plan before.
Well, I mean, as a general point, the Mayor can turn down any application that doesn't accord with his planning policy. I'm not quite sure what you're...
Well, in this policy, and it wasn't in the previous plan, boroughs are to resist developments with significantly high room sizes. Doesn't say what significantly means, but it could be room size.
Room sizes or space standards?
Room sizes.
And this is also not, this is more planning committee than...
Well, okay, sorry, but I'm concerned that the Mayor is going to default to the London plan if he gets a developer who's perhaps trying to get away with not providing the kind of homes that Havering or Tower Hamlets want, but the Mayor will grant them because there's nothing in the London plan to stop him from accepting.
So what was the question now?
I don't know, it was a kind of question. I'm just, don't you feel that there is insufficient protection for the boroughs to be able to fashion local housing developments according to their local need? Probably a question.
I hesitate to sound like a broken record, but the draft London plan, for the first time, requires boroughs to set out guidance on what unit size mix they want to see in local rented housing. Okay. So, in terms of their cover by the London plan, it is clearer and stronger than it has ever been.
I think that really is debatable. Can we hear from the Tower Hamlets about the room sizes?
Yeah, I mean, certainly from Tower Hamlets' point of view, the issue of overcrowding is massive, and it's something we monitor very carefully locally and set ourselves targets around. So in terms of our waiting list, our housing register, many thousands of households on that register, and we know we have thousands of children in overcrowded conditions, and we want to address that, and we are addressing that. So in terms of being able to set clear targets for the social sector in terms of new developments, that's something we already do, and so we welcome that. In terms of the mix, actually if you look at our housing register, it's 2 beds that we have the biggest need for, but equally we do have large extended families, we do have a need for larger bed sizes as well. I'm sorry, I haven't got all the figures in front of me, but we could send you that.
But the source of that 2-bed requirement, the source of your assessment, is that the SHMA or?
We've done our own local housing market assessment, and we've obviously got our housing register, which provides details of people.
Okay, but then again, it's cold stats rather than weighting according to any social need of.
Well, as I say, we've got figures for overcrowding locally, which we can provide to you.
That would be very useful, actually.
So I think our concern, we would like to be able to require developers to provide family-sized homes, not just in the social sector, but also in the market sector. That's something we would want to see happening. And I take the point that those homes don't always end up immediately going to a family, but in terms of the future stock mix in the borough, we would want to see family-sized homes in the market sector too. That's something we would like to be able to put into our requirements as part.
So you'll agree with what Tom Copley said earlier, that this isn't really about who's going to move next into that accommodation. It's about, in the long term, the stock being available to accommodate London's needs in the future.
Exactly.
I have a couple of follow-ups to the boroughs, about local needs assessments. You're doing these, you're looking at overcrowding locally and the needs locally, are they all done according to the same methodology? Are they comparable? Because one thing I noticed from the London plan is that, well, we've got overall figures for London about overcrowding that come from the English housing survey. That doesn't break down per borough. Like we said before, there's 2,000 per year. Even to get London-wide estimates, they look at them across a 3-year basis. Are you all using the same methods? Are your overcrowding statistics comparable so that we could build up a picture across London?
My understanding is that Barshmar is good practice and meets all the necessary requirements. It's certainly been shared with the London Plan team because they've commented on our emerging local plan, and I'm not aware of any concerns about how we've done the work. We've done an assessment which is actually shared with Barking and Dagenham and with Redbridge as well, so it's the housing market area, which again we understand to be what we have to do.
Yeah, the mayor encourages sub-regional.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
Tower Hamlets, you use the same methods as other boroughs to work out your needs in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are one or two differences. So I think in terms of the GLA, SMAR, for the affordable sector, there's a higher number of one-beds coming out for Tower Hamlets than our own assessment. So there's a few anomalies like that, which I think is something to do with the application of benefit rules. I'm not an expert on that area.
I'd be really. We've been looking at the SMAR in some detail. We'd be interested to know the differences. The other question I have is, when you're using your housing registers, the people who are registered for social housing as part of assessing that need. If you've got an older person who's living in social housing in a larger than needed home, do you, when you're doing a downsizing programme, when you're assessing their need, are you assessing them as needing a one-bed? Because social housing, how much bed in bedrooms you can get, that's got really tight lately when it comes to allocations policies. So are you assuming that the older people in social housing will move into one-beds?
In terms of what we offer people, we generally offer people a 2-bed if that's what they want. Some people do want a 1-bed. I don't think it's a blanket policy. Obviously, there'll be a difference in the rent. So for some people, that makes an impact, and they'd rather choose to pay less rent. And obviously, heating the home and all those factors, there's a higher cost if you take a 2-bed on.
When you offer a downsizing incentive, that applies even if they're moving into a 2-bed then? Mm-hmm. Okay, and is that the same in Havering?
It's the same. We do encourage downsizing where applicable. Funnily enough, our revised housing allocations policy went through our cabinet last week. It's gone out for consultation. Some of the general feedback from local members is so someone may live on their own, but what if they've got needs or a carer or someone that's coming to stay? I think that's a fair challenge, actually. It's made me think twice as well about, it's not just about the one, but it's about the individual needs. So we need to look at the individual cases of each individual, I think, when we look at the allocations policy.
Okay, and how do you measure overcrowding? I mean, because the English Housing Survey doesn't let you do it.
I defer to you. I'm not an expert.
So my understanding is the only consistent borough level measure of overcrowding is the census, which is obviously very frustrating because it's a 10-year measure. So the latest data we have that's robust at a borough level is census. So the EHS is robust at a London-wide level, and that's what we use to inform the SMAR. At borough level, it's always a challenge with local SMARs, which is one of the reasons why we don't kind of strongly support borough level SMARs to get the kind of level of detail you need on housing needs, just because it's all in the census.
Can't we do something like
that? So that is really difficult because you are devolving this to the boroughs. I mean, one thing I would quite like to feed back to you is that this could do with a London-wide strategy. Yeah. James has given some nice examples of work that Islington has done, but there doesn't seem to be anything in this policies to encourage that, or even within the housing strategy. And measuring it would be the starting point, wouldn't it?
Just to distinguish, just because there isn't a consistent borough level way to measure overcrowding, that doesn't mean that every borough in each case will use, for example, their waiting list. And that's partly determined by what your waiting list policy is, because not everyone can join the waiting list. But most boroughs are able, on their own, to make an assessment of the number of overcrowded households who need social rented housing. It's just those numbers aren't comparable between boroughs because there isn't a consistent way to do that. So
we'd really like the Mayor to do some work on this. And it can't, if you're looking for one thing, it can't be that hard to do.
We made this recommendation in 2011.
Thank you.
And so we'd really like one mayor to do it. I might say something nice about them.
Okay, we're going to have to move on to the next topic.
Not likely, but I might.
Am I allowed to ask a thing?
We have very little time, and we need to talk about small sites, Nikki. I'm really sorry.
It could be written, the question, because I think it's very relevant. The current SHMA is based on the English Household Survey to a certain extent, and you told us when we had our informal meeting about it that it was also based on aspiration, and it's only a sample of 2,000. What I want to know is, was the last SHMA, you could write and tell us, was the last SHMA also based on an English Household Survey of 2,000? And also, could you just tell us that as far as I know, the last SHMA came up with a need for many more family houses than this SHMA does. And I'd be interested to know how we got to that, and how we got to this SHMA, which comes up with so few family houses.
So I believe it was based on the same English Household Survey, but I might, because James was involved in the previous one.
Yeah, so essentially the methodology is the same as the previous SHMA, which made it through an examination in public and the inspector was happy with. Obviously, where there is more recent data available, we've used more recent data. And on your point about family and smaller units, our demographic projections have changed. We now think, and our demographers tell us this, that the number of smaller households that are going to be forming over the 25-year period of the SHMA is going to be larger than we envisaged in 2013 when we did the previous SHMA. So basically the facts have changed.
Yeah, but the previous SHMA wasn't based on the English Household Survey that you're using. It was based on a much earlier one, which I think was the London Household Survey, which was very, very complete. But I may be wrong. I just want facts.
Thank you, Assembly Member Gavron. If you could write to us sorting out some of those, I'd appreciate it. Assembly Member Cooper.
Back to size, but this time site size, and looking specifically at small sites, which obviously, James, you covered in your initial remarks. We've got the target for 38% of the 65,000 dwellings to be delivered on small sites, which I think equates to 24,700 units on 988 sites if you assumed that they were all going to be 25 dwellings, so it could be up to 1,000 if some are smaller than that. Can you explain how you arrived at this target?
Sure. So, as you rightly say, small sites are a really important component of the overall land supply for hitting the 65,000 capacity target. And what the modelling did is look at the trends in intensification amongst small sites in London, and assumed that rate of growth can be replicated at a greater frequency across London as encouraged by the policy. So, for instance, it identifies which homes where existing residential accommodation could be intensified. So within 800 metres of a town centre or a tube or rail station, or places with P-Town 3 to 6. It then applies assumptions around the rate of growth that could be expected to those sites as a result of the presumption in favour of development in the new draft London plan. And it obviously adjusts some of the expectations based on whether there's a conservation area and so on, assuming a lot less intensification can happen, or it can happen at a much slower rate rather in conservation areas, even if they are near to a tube station and so on. So broadly speaking, works out what the observable trends are at the moment, what have been in recent years in terms of small sites. Takes the London plan assumption of a presumption in favour of well-designed, high-density development on small sites.
Come back to the presumption in favour in a minute, but I mean, how confident are you that almost 40% of the 65,000 being delivered on these smaller sites is actually achievable? And I mean that in terms of both the acceptance by local people issue, which I raised before, acceptance by local politicians of that densification or intensification, but also in terms of, you know, the burden on things like, you know, drainage and water supply. You know, it looks as though Cape Town is actually going to literally run out of water very soon. You know, and we're just about to hear from Thames Water on their 80-year plan for supply and demand. But as we...
I think the importance of bringing Londoners with you. I mean, one really important thing for me is around the emphasis on good design, around what higher density housing can look like, because you know, I think people want the confidence that if they are going to see new homes built, particularly in their local neighbourhood, that the design is going to be appropriate to the local area, that it is going to be well designed and so on. And so there's a real emphasis in the London Plan, the draft London Plan, trying to encourage boroughs to set out principles of good design, so design guides for what smaller housing developments should look like, to ensure that good design is really locked in as far as possible to these developments coming forward. I mean, there is a slight point. I don't want to imply this answers your question in its entirety, but there is a slight point around the fact that there are people living in London already who might be living in overcrowding or you know, not having a home which is suitable for their needs, and actually building the new housing means that you don't necessarily always offer space for new people to move to London. They might be in London already, just not living in the right sort of housing, whereas this way they can get a decent home. And by virtue of planning permission being granted, there will be a Section 106 requirement associated with it, and so on, to to make a contribution to the local area. So I think it's not necessarily binary in terms of new housing means that there are more people living in a local area, because sometimes it can be people living there just living in overcrowding or in unsuitable housing, moving somewhere more suited to their needs, and then getting the benefits of development in terms of Section 106 and so on. But I think I will agree with you that...
Perhaps my vision of this is slightly coloured by some issues that we've had around this in Wandsworth, where a lot of people live in overcrowded conditions on one side of the road, and then the blocks of luxury flats built on the other side are literally beyond them, both because they're on the other side of the road, but of course they cannot possibly afford the price tag associated with the luxury flats, many of which are then dark blocks and nobody actually moves into them. So that's really been quite offensive to local people, and I don't think that's just a Wandsworth issue. I think that's been an issue more widely across the whole of London, and it's one in fact that the Mayor himself commented on. I think it's really important that we make sure that we carry local people and we don't create more blocks that people just buy holiday flats in. So I think that's absolutely essential. Yeah. Can I ask you then to come back to the presumption in favour? How helpful is that presumption in favour, and who is it most helpful to?
So the presumption in favour is a really important part of the policy in terms of giving greater encouragement to development on small sites. And part of this, part of the reason why it's important to have that shift is to give small and medium builders greater confidence around building developments. Because when you talk to small and medium builders, some of the issues which come up frequently are around access to sites, access to finance, and planning risk. Because if you're a very small builder, and you buy a site with which there's a lot of planning risk associated, you're in quite a precarious position and might actually shy away from it if there's a huge amount of planning risk associated with that development going forward. If there's a shift within planning policy through this presumption in favour to decrease the risk of buying that site and then going in for planning permission, we hope it will encourage more small and medium builders to get involved in bringing forward these sites. So I would hope, and I think certainly from industry feedback from small and medium builders, they have welcomed the greater certainty this gives them.
I think that would be very welcome, because I think it's certainly something that we've identified in this committee, and I know that Andrew and I raised this over the development of some of the TfL sites, that the necessity for giving that assistance to the small and medium enterprises in the building sector. And I was glad to hear that some of the boroughs were referring to the need to meet the skills shortage, because obviously as you start to bring forward those sites, and perhaps the SMEs, they might grow from being small to medium building companies, they need the skilled staff to be able to develop those sites out. Will you have a specific target for how well you're doing on developing out the small sites, and how will that be monitored? Will we be able to see reports here to see that the 988 to 1,000, or possibly slightly more, depending on how small they are, how many of those are being developed and when. You're talking about them being valuable because we can also do them at an early stage. So I think we'd be very keen to see that they are starting to move.
So, in the draft plan, it sets out, as you say, the specific targets for small sites, and that's the first time that small sites delivery has been identified separately
yes.
from the aggregate numbers. So that shows the emphasis we're putting on it. I mean, there's a question around. Was a question around bringing forward the sites or the buildings?
When and how are we going to review progress towards meeting the targets is really the most important issue here.
Okay, sorry, yes. So the AMR, the Annual Monitoring Report, which monitors the implementation of the London Plan, that will follow up on the targets set out in the London Plan, so we'll be able to see it in that context.
Okay. And if some of the boroughs, and obviously we understand that you're working with the boroughs, some may embrace the targets more than others, some horses may be needed to take them to the water trough, and some may indeed need to have their heads shoved into the water. There'll be sort of a kind of a dance towards meeting the targets. But what remedies, should you find the horses unwilling to drink from the water, what remedies are you going to apply if the boroughs are really falling short around seeing these smaller sites developed out?
So I think, if we just focus rather than going sort of general conformity, but if I just talk about the small sites in particular, if I can just get the text so I can refer to it precisely, but in terms of the small sites, where it talks about the presumption in favour, it suggests that local boroughs should, let me just get the right part here, in H2E, when it says presumption in favour means approving small housing developments which are in accordance with the design code developed in accordance with Part B. So it basically says to boroughs, develop a design code, and if you have that design code, that then means that small sites will have to be approved if they're in accordance with that design code. It then says where there is no such design code, the presumption means approving small housing developments unless it can be demonstrated the development would give rise to unacceptable harm to privacy and so on. So there is a kind of baseline protection there in terms of blocking developments where they impact on privacy and so on. For boroughs to have a greater degree of influence over what's developed, a design code means that they can then judge an application against that design code. So there's a kind of incentive in the system there for boroughs to proactively develop design codes about what might be acceptable or not in terms of small site development, because they'll then be able to judge an application whether it accords with that design code.
But supposing they're still, they've got their design codes sorted out, you still feel that they're dragging their feet. Is there any kind of remedy that you can apply to make them move things forward?
Boroughs will develop their local plans in due course, and conformity between the London Plan and local plans is part of the plan setting process, so it will influence individual boroughs in that way, as well as clearly there's the appeals process, which applicants are always open to go down that route.
I think it's just a concern because you're talking about almost 40% of the delivery coming through this route. So, where the Mayor has a sort of much stronger role in planning applications that are more than 30 metres high or have more than 150 units, you are relying on the boroughs much more strongly here.
It's clearly we want to do everything in partnership with the boroughs. The presumption favour is clearly a different approach for the small sites than the larger sites, because on the larger sites, as you rightly say, the Mayor can have a direct influence over planning response to individual applications, so he has that way of getting involved. On the smaller sites, you're right, we are never going to get involved in the very small sites in that way, which is why the presumption in favour is a really important way in which the Mayor, through the London Plan, can shift the focus and try and arrive at a new kind of normal situation for this.
So that is effectively the main lever to bring them forward. What about the decision to encourage the application of Section 106 payments to sites delivering under 10 homes? Why have you decided to do that? So
that basically reflects the fact that at the moment the policy for on-site affordable housing tends to apply to schemes with more than 10 units, but we recognise the fact that the smaller sites are going to make a big contribution towards housing delivery generally in London. We want to make sure that where possible they're making a contribution to affordable housing as well. And in some boroughs it might work better in some boroughs than others. But we want to make sure we're supporting boroughs where they are capturing some of that benefit from the smaller schemes for affordable housing in the borough more broadly.
And do you think there might be a problem for the smaller builders in terms of the Section 106 payments coming in as a disincentive? We've talked about incentives, the presumption in favour, and trying to smooth the process of bringing the smaller sites forward. Don't you think the Section 106 might act as a bit of a brake on some of their ambitions? Because obviously they are operating on a slimmer margin, so that might not be something that they would like.
I think that it would always be up to a borough to consider its policy around this in terms of its viability, more generally when they're introducing the policy, and then by exception on individual schemes. So there is
so there can be an exception.
Well, it's up to boroughs to apply it in the way that they want on viability grounds. But again, that would come down to viability on that situation, which people would want to avoid if possible, but there is always a viability route if it really is undeliverable.
Right. So it is something that the borough will make a decision, and so could support the small builder by not requiring that sort of wider capture in the way that we've just described for the Section 106.
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
So the Section 106 additional payment could be removed if the borough considers that it compromises the viability and would stop the scheme coming forward, but obviously we then don't get that wider capture.
So the viability route is always open to applicants to make that case. I think I wasn't saying specifically viability applies here more than elsewhere. It's simply that viability is a route open to all applicants. There are other things which boroughs can do to support small builders. For instance, the phasing of the payments. So making sure that they're not that you have to pay that contribution to affordable housing up front. You can pay it later down the line near completion, or so on, so that you don't have the cash flow issues. So there are other ways in which boroughs can support small and medium builders. Indeed, the Mayor in his SIL charging schedule did that for some of the more small and medium-sized builders to reflect the fact that cash flow is an issue. So there are ways that you can mitigate viability concerns.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tom, you had a follow-up question?
I just on the presumption in favour. We talked to the planning committee yesterday. Actually, the difference between the sort of approach here based on policy-based approach and a regulatory-based approach that they might use in some European countries, where you tick enough boxes and that's it, you're through. Is that basically what, if you meet the design code, that's it? You've got planning permission.
I think using that analogy is probably going too far. That it's not entirely the kind of the model you have in some other countries where it's very regulatory and there is discretion, but it is shifting the balance a bit toward presumption in favour. So it is shifting the balance towards saying, unless there is a reason to reject this, we anticipate it being approved. And the baseline of the London Plan is impacts on privacy and so on. But to give greater protection for a local area, if boroughs can introduce design codes, that then means that planning applications can be judged against them as well, and then be considered on that basis whether to accept or reject them. So it is still discretionary. I don't want to give the impression this is moving to an entirely formulaic system. I think that's probably going too far. But it's certainly saying within the element of discretion that exists within the planning system in London, it is shifting it toward, as it says, a presumption in favour.
Okay.
Nikki?
James, you talked about, I think it was Leonie's question really, about delivery. And are you considering any incentivisation of pooling? Pooling might not be the right word, but aggregating some of these small sites so that they become more appealing, maybe. Would that work? I'm just wondering if...
I think that's a really interesting question, because what we were talking a bit earlier around the what the barriers are to small and medium builders. Clearly we're focusing here on planning and planning risk, but the other aspects which are essential as well are finance and access to land. And in terms of land, the Mayor is developing a small sites programme, which is to make it easier to bring forward small sites from the public sector. And that would be a way of bringing forward small sites for small builders to then develop out. So I think the focus on land and around what small builders might like in terms of land is as important. I think maybe sort of pooling sites through the planning system might be tricky to give a steer on through the London plan, but I think using our wider interventions in land is important to work out what might be more attractive to developers, and if developers suggested that pooling sites might be attractive, that's something we could look at.
It's something the OSN sector has talked quite a lot about, but also it's something TfL's talking about, isn't it? You're looking at, aren't they, aggregating sites?
Yes. I mean, so the small sites which the mayor wants to pilot will be with TfL sites, so that'll be using some of their small sites and bringing them forward.
Do you see that if you pool, could it be a way of then getting, say you put 7 sites together with, I don't know, 15 homes on some and so on, but in the end you get quite a chunk of homes. Could you then, you'd be above the threshold of course, then you'd get the affordable housing in, wouldn't you? Or could you?
So I think certainly in terms of, for instance, the mayor's small sites programme, that's something which he's keen to look at, making sure that we're getting decent levels of affordable housing, for instance, on the TfL sites coming forward, even if some of them are very small, maybe you have a broader portfolio approach. But I think, I suppose in terms of strict planning rules, it could be up to an individual applicant to link 2 sites and to make a planning case on that basis. We have seen situations where you have different planning applications for sites, but the applicant asks for them to be considered together. So I think, in a way, that option does exist to applicants already to kind of join sites in their consideration. But I think I'm not sure. I might ask for some advice on this one, whether it would be possible to formally put that in, but I suspect it would be up to the applicant whether they wanted to join them or not.
Yeah, I think that is the case. I mean, I think the encouragement of affordable housing on sites of 10 and fewer implicitly assumes we'd be able to deliver that funding on other small sites in some ways, so you get that kind of wider benefit by making the policy more enabling and seeing more of these sites come forward, and also getting more SIL and things like that, so it has a kind of cumulative benefit in its own right. But yeah, to echo what James said, you could very well see sites pulled together and linked, and you get scale, it's economies of scale benefits and design continuity and benefits like that locally as well. So that's all enabled by the policy, and certainly something we'd like to see happen.
Yeah, I also see that. I mean, I know you're not doing anything about, you're not having a policy on downsizing from private homes, but we know there are 800,000 homes with 2 or more bedrooms empty in London, and I'm just wondering, I can see people downsizing in their own community, and I think the small sites policy gives an opportunity for that people who don't want to move out of their community and would downsize from these larger homes. Anyway, it's just a thought.
That's certainly what's informed our thinking on the policy.
On the policy presumption in favour of small sites?
Yes.
But you haven't included...
I mean, it's not explicitly included in the policy because there's a limit, so we can't, it's not about mandating to people what they should do, but it's about enabling that to happen. And in a way, we would see more downsizing through this policy potentially.
Is it London of Havering? Would that work for Havering then? Can you imagine small sites being places where people in the larger family houses in Havering could downsize to?
Possibly. I think it's 68% of our total build programme, or total target, obviously, at London Boroughs is a small sites. It's not in the 30 or 40% either. So this is a particular issue for us. I mean, that's certainly something we could factor in. I've got a range of things I'd like to say, but I'll kind of stop there now. That's fine.
Great. We've got 10 minutes left for the entire rest of the committee, and we've got a whole other question to come, but we do have follow-ups, and we need to hear from the boroughs on this issue. So can we hear first of all from the boroughs on the small sites questions and how you feel about it?
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I think the quantity of, or the aspiration of what we could develop on small sites is I think politically, locally in Havering, has gone down with concern. and members are trying to understand how that's going to work, how and protect the characteristics of the borough. It is an outer London borough, and that's one of the things that the leader of the council has said on numerous occasions, saying, you know, it's about protecting the place. So it's encouraging to hear about design and protection of design.
Yeah, are you not encouraged by the
Yes.
design codes,
Yes,
the
yes.
area strategies
Absolutely.
you're being asked to produce?
And that's so I think there's a lot of unknowns, I think, around this.
Okay.
So there's a whole thing about, well, what does this actually mean in reality? And really working up the protections locally and trying to make sure that that's articulated in a way so people understand it. So certainly local members will default originally to a position of pessimism, I think, in relation to something like that. So again, it's just working that through. I think technically it's trying to understand the business case and how that works. The economies of scale question, I think, was an interesting one in relation to the affordability of developers to be able to build out on a small scale if it's not pooled on aggregate of sites. Is that going to affect the deliverability of affordable housing? Question mark. I don't know. That fragmented approach potentially could see a loss of total placemaking and shaping and the ability to negotiate more opportunity for infrastructure investment because it's too fragmented. So I think strategically I'm not sort of clear about, in reality, if it was 10% of the target, I think we'd say, okay, we'll sort of work with that, we'll sort of chug along with it and see where we are. But it's the majority. I'm not quite sure how something so significant is going to work in practice, where we probably do have a better handle on large site development and how we can maximise the benefits and the needs going forward. So lots of question marks, I think.
It is a whole new policy. Tower Hamlets, how are you?
Yeah, we welcome this, and we have our similar concerns about deliverability. Particular issue just in terms of the local planning authority processing all of this. You know, if you have a planning officer and there's a large site, one person can in effect produce a lot of homes, and if you give that person then a whole load of small sites, albeit with the presumption here that it should be less work, but there's that issue about the capacity of the system, and then there's, as I said earlier, the issue about the capacity of the industry to build it. So one of the things we're working on at the moment, which I think fits with this, is around the self-build model, where we've got small sites in council ownership. We've started a self-builder register. We've got a lot of very interested people, and we're looking at supporting them to deliver on small sites. Which we think is it's just another way of making sure there's more capacity for people to do this.
I think one of the questions that does come up is about public acceptance, and we discussed that quite a bit at the planning committee yesterday. But one thing I want to ask about is the way that the design section and the housing section of the policy don't seem to quite match on this. So when residents are looking for reassurance that they'll be able to influence how different small sites are being developed, you know, the worry, the what did you say, the default to pessimism that people have when you hear that the small sites are up for grabs and it's all going to be very tall, and people want some reassurance they'll have some influence. And policy H2, which is in the housing section, calls for area-wide design codes. And it says, you know, how additional housing can be accommodated in different locations, and the word there is not on each small site, it's in different locations. And then within the design policies, we've got the request for area-based strategies, looking at the capacity for growth and how many homes you could fit in, and the different sort of housing types and typologies and things like that. But there it doesn't mention saying, you know, assigning a typology to an individual small site. So you can sort of see how, combined with the push for density, people might assume plans are going to come forwards for these small sites near stations that have more density than people are comfortable with, and people want to know that they can say, well, actually, this is fine as long as it's these typologies that we want. And the area-based strategies in D2 are subject to more, as far as I can tell, consultation than the design codes in HG. So I don't know if these two things need to be matched up better and have one set of here's how we'll consult about the amount, the type, the design of these small sites in your area to reassure people.
So I guess it's possible to give us a partial answer to your question, I think, which is that, I mean, the expectation on the design codes is to be led by boroughs. Yes, that is clearly a borough responsibility to lead on that. Obviously, we'll support however we can, but the idea is that boroughs do something which is appropriate for their area. What the GLA is going to be doing this year is developing supplementary planning guidance around housing design, and clearly an important part of that will be, how in the 21st century you could build at higher densities in an appropriate way that people think is appropriate for their area. So that would include a lot of the issues around optimising density on bigger sites as well as smaller sites. But obviously that as being slightly broader than the design codes, which will be led by boroughs.
Yeah. So the question is, when you're asking for it to be applied to particular sites in a particular area, the area-wide things, which are an area-wide design code and an area-based strategy, those two things seem to be where residents can get in and influence what happens on their particular small sites. But it's just not completely clear what the process is for that. I know it's up to boroughs, but it's the expectations of boroughs in terms of public engagement ought to be perhaps clearer here.
Pretty worth also stressing that the plan should be read as a whole. So just because we haven't repeated the design policies under the housing policies, it doesn't mean they don't apply. And we sought to kind of keep it within 600 pages. It would have been a lot longer if we'd repeated ourselves. But also we've already started talking to boroughs about how we can support them on design codes. And if what boroughs are saying is we need support through supplementary planning guidance, specifically on the issue of design codes and how they should be developed, then we're more than happy to consider that. And that's something we're aiming to do quite soon.
Also, this is what's in D2, is area-wide strategies to determine the capacity of the sites in that area. And that's what worries people most, not so much the colour of the bricks and things. It's the how many homes will be fitted in.
Sean, how can people, how do a borough like Havering or Tower Hamlets, how do they know what the capacity is when some of it can come from conversions? And in fact, conversions are counted as part of your small site target.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of work.
I don't know how you deal with capacity when it's a bit of an unknown quantity, what's going to come forward in conversions. Could somebody answer that?
Have you got any plans yet, Havering, for how to do this?
I think it goes back down to the really high importance of design codes to get the quality that we want out of these schemes. And I was just saying to Steve, hopefully quietly, I think there's a real issue in places like Outer London about how these schemes are delivered and the implementation of them. In Inner and Central London, everybody is well used to schemes being fitted in from a construction point of view into tricky, difficult to develop sites. In Outer London, that's still quite novel to us. And I think there'll be scope for getting some sort of accreditation scheme, if you like, for smaller developers and smaller builders who have a good track record of delivering these sort of high-pressure schemes where they are surrounded by back garden land or residential properties or commercial properties. And I think if you begin to put all the pieces of the jigsaw together, the design codes and the accreditation to reliable developers rather than somebody who just fancies developing a small site, then you begin to have the tools to work towards the aspiration that the Mayor has for the numbers involved.
Okay, thank you. We're really running out of time, but we do have...
Deal with conversions.
Very quick. We are really running out of time. We're going to have to...
It's a big issue.
Can we ask a very, very quick question from Tom about just a couple of particular groups that we've...
Yes, so the question is, how does the plan cater for the needs of specialist groups like gypsy travellers, students and people who require supported accommodation?
So there are specific sections set out in the London plan around that, and particularly start with gypsy and traveller accommodation. It suggests that boroughs should plan to meet the identified need for pitches. Part of the way that we've approached the policy around gypsy and traveller needs in the draft London plan and in the draft housing strategy is we consider it to be an improvement on what we inherited in terms of working out what the needs are and in terms of working out what the definition is of people from that community, to make sure that people aren't excluded because they're not currently living in that lifestyle. They might be living in a bricks and mortar building, but that's not out of choice. That's because they've been forced to by a circumstance. So the definition of what counts as a member of that community is being expanded, and we developed that in consultation with representatives from the community, as well as I say, saying the borough should identify what the need is in their local area. So there's a stronger approach there for gypsies and traveller pitches. Clearly the provision is well short of the need, and so there is an ability for boroughs to apply for affordable housing funding as well, to support some of those developments. But it is something where the need is not met by the supply at the moment.
Absolutely, and I'm really pleased that this expanded definition has been adopted, because there's been such a eroding over the last few years by the government, changing the definition and reducing responsibilities on local authorities to actually provide for the accommodation needs of gypsy and travellers. I think that's really important. How that then is translated into boroughs, for example, applying for funding from the Affordable Homes Programme, I think is a sort of different question, and probably not for this meeting, but I do think this takes us in a very good direction. I want to just ask quickly about student accommodation, because I know we're running out of time. This, I think, for the first time, sets a provision for a percentage of affordable student accommodation, which I don't think was in there before, 35%. In the supporting text, it talks about the definition of affordable being determined by the work of the Mayor's Academic Forum. Could you talk a bit about that? I presume is this some sort of public definition of what counts as affordable student accommodation?
So you might ask Alex to jump in on that with some of the details.
Sure.
So the academic forum has existed for a number of years. All its papers are on the website, so you can see we had discussions over a number of months with them, which includes the NUS, universities, boroughs, about how we should come up with establishing what is student income, because it's very difficult to define. It's unlike other people living in London. And then what proportion of that rent should be, of their income should be spent on accommodation in purpose-built. We're only talking about purpose-built student accommodation, not talking about rent in private housing. So unlike that, in purpose-built student accommodation, you have often other amenities, you have services provided, and so considering all those factors to come up with this definition.
It's more of a co-living situation,
yes.
than housing one. And in terms of who, I was going to call them nomination rights, who would determine who would get the affordable student accommodation? How is that determined?
So the way we set it out is that these new accommodation has to have a link to a university, and it will be the responsibility of the university to identify need amongst their student cohort and then allocate the rooms appropriately. So the university will be the people that know most about who's in need, and so it's them to allocate it.
Okay, thank you. Given the time,
I'll leave one final quick thing about the student accommodation. Section 4.17.7 sets out that the current sort of definition is 55% of the maximum income that a new full-time student could receive from the government's maintenance loan. So can I confirm, and that seems like a high number, except that it seems not to include any money they might make from working. So is that why it's such a high number, that it excludes, and there's no assumption there that they would work?
Yes, so we were looking for a way to figure out what would be a student income. There's lots of different studies on this, and excluding people's money over the summertime vacation period was something we worked quite closely with NUS about. They wanted, because it was about this is almost a proxy for all students about what they could have. So it's basically maybe you don't get the full maintenance loan, but you do some work and it tops it up to that level. But it's saying every student that's from outside London could get that money.
And the NUS are happy with this definition at the moment, but it's kind of under review. That's why it's not written into the policy.
It's not under review. It means that because the maintenance loan changes every year.
Yes, there's
So it will change if with government changes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, that's it. I think. Thank you very much to the guests for your contributions. That was a very long meeting. We've a couple more bits of our agenda to finish off, but feel free to go and get your lunch. Can I ask the committee to note the report and agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the group leads to agree the committee's submission on the draft London plan?
Agreed.
Good fun. Item 6 on the agenda is our work programme. Can I ask the committee to agree the update to the work programme for the current year? That's in paragraphs 4.1 to 4.6 of that report.
Agreed.
Thank you. And the next meeting is the 27th of February at 10 o'clock in committee room 5. And there's no other urgent business. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Social housing postgram.
GLA, committee room 5, South.